Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and the old stories of our planet take the scenic route to slumber. Tonight's gentle journey carries us far out into the Pacific, to a small volcanic island surrounded by more ocean than almost anywhere else humans have ever called home. It is a place of dark stone, long winds, rolling grass, old roads, silent platforms, and hundreds of enormous faces staring inland as if they are still waiting for someone to remember what they were meant to say. We are going to Rapa Nui, better known to much of the world as Easter Island, and we're stepping into a mystery that has never quite settled down. For generations, people have looked at the Moai statues and wondered why they were made, how they were moved, what they meant, and why so many of them seem to stand with such strange patience. They are often described as monuments to ancestors, symbols of power, sacred figures, or silent witnesses to a society that rose in isolation and then suffered terrible loss. Those explanations matter. They're grounded in the living culture and in the careful work of archaeology. But recently, a newer and more unusual idea has begun to circle around the island like a seabird looking for a place to land. What if the Moai were not only statues? What if the island itself was arranged like a memory system? What if platforms, roads, statue positions, shadows, carved signs, and even stone hats were once part of a way to store knowledge about seasons, navigation, sound, and the sea? It is an idea that sounds almost too strange at first, the kind of thing that makes you pause with your tea halfway to your mouth. Ancient stone figures as a kind of data system. A remote island as a living archive, AI looking at old surveys and finding patterns that human eyes may have missed. And yet, whether we treat the idea as a bold theory, a useful thought experiment, or a mystery still waiting for better evidence, it gives us a new way to look at Rapa Nui. Not as a lonely place at the edge of the world, but as a place where knowledge may once have been organised in stone, landscape, memory and movement. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you near the sea, far inland, awake under a bright afternoon sky, or tucked into some quiet hour where the rest of the house has gone still? And if you happen to know the time where you are, feel free to share it, because this story, in its own strange way, is also about time. Not time measured by clocks, but time measured by sunrise, planting seasons, ocean currents, star paths, and the long memory of people who had to read the world very carefully to survive. And if you find this journey soothing, intriguing, or just a gentle way to let the day loosen its grip, I would be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm reach other curious travellers who might enjoy falling asleep with ancient stones, quiet islands, and the occasional mystery that refuses to behave itself. I do hope this does not become so interesting that it keeps you awake. But if it does, well, at least you will be awake in the company of giant stone faces, Pacific winds, and a question large enough to make the modern world feel just a little smaller. So settle in, slow your thoughts, and let the ocean widen around us. Imagine the island first, not from the ground, but from above. A small triangular shape in a blue immensity. No nearby continent, no easy harbour of neighbouring lands. Just a volcanic island lifted out of the Pacific with cliffs, craters, lava fields, caves, grassy slopes, and the long white noise of waves striking stone. To reach Rapa Nui in the ancient world was not a casual journey. It was an act of navigation, courage, memory, and skill. Polynesian voyagers crossed huge distances in canoes, guided not by printed maps or satellite signals, but by stars, swells, birds, winds, clouds, and the deep knowledge carried in chance, training, and practice. They did not sail through emptiness. They sailed through signs. That matters because the people who reached Rapa Nui were not lost children drifting by accident into the unknown. They belong to one of the greatest voyaging traditions in human history. Polynesian navigators understood the ocean as something readable. Not simple, not tame, not always forgiving, but readable. A swell coming from one direction could speak of distant storms. The flight path of a bird could hint at land beyond the horizon. Certain stars rose and set in dependable ways. The ocean surface changed near islands. Clouds gathered differently over land. To us, the Pacific may look like endless blue. To trained eyes, it was full of information. A moving book written in water and sky. So when we look at Rapa Nui and see hundreds of stone figures, it may be worth asking whether we are looking only at religious monuments, or whether we are looking at something that belonged to a wider culture of memory. Not data, in the modern sense, of course. Not wires, screens, files, or anything like the glowing rectangle that may currently be doing its best to keep you awake, but data as structured knowledge. Information arranged so that it can be remembered, repeated, taught, and used. Ancient people had many ways of doing this. Some used knots, some used songs, some used carved signs, some used landscape itself, turning mountains, stones, paths, and sacred places into reminders of stories and practical knowledge. Rapa Nui is often described through loss, deforestation, conflict, disease, enslavement, colonial violence, and the shattering effects of outside contact. Those parts of the story cannot be brushed aside. They are real, painful, and essential. But there is another part too. Before the losses, there was achievement. People carved almost 1,000 moai from volcanic tuff, shaped them with stone tools, moved many across the island, raised them on platforms called ahua, and created a landscape that was not random. The statues were not sprinkled about like someone dropped them from a careless basket. They occupied places. They faced directions. They stood in relation to communities, coastlines, resources, roads, and ceremonial spaces. For a long time, archaeologists have studied these relationships with maps, excavations, oral traditions, measurements, and careful comparisons. What makes the new AI-centered idea unusual is not that it notices the island has patterns. Researchers already knew that. The unusual part is the claim that when a machine learning system compares enough details at once, statue orientation, platform spacing, old road lines, solar events, acoustic properties, carved symbols and landscape features, a larger structure begins to appear. The suggestion is that Rapa Nui may have worked almost like a distributed archive. Not one library building, not one temple holding all knowledge, but a whole island where knowledge was spread across stone and place. That is a powerful image. A library you walk through, a calendar you cast shadows upon, a navigation chart you remember through movement, a sound system built not with speakers, but with stone, open air, and human voices. It is also an image that needs caution. AI can find patterns, but it can also find patterns that are not truly meaningful. Give a machine enough points on a map and it may begin to draw lines that look convincing, especially if humans are already hoping for mystery. We should remember that. A pattern is not automatically a message. A line is not automatically a code. A coincidence is not always a clue. The human brain loves connection so much that it sometimes knits sweaters out of fog. Still, this is where the idea becomes interesting rather than simply fanciful. On Rapa Nui, the patterns being discussed are not floating in empty space. They connect to things we already know matter deeply in Polynesian cultures: ancestry, navigation, astronomy, seasonality, ritual, land, water, memory, and authority. The moai were not just large objects. They were figures with meaning, linked to ancestors and community identity. The ahu platforms were not just bases, they were sacred and social centres. Roads were not just paths, they were routes of movement, ceremony, transport and connection. And the sky was not just decoration above the island, it was a guide, a clock, a compass, and a story field. So the question becomes quieter and more careful. Not, did Easter Island secretly contain a computer made of stone? That would be a rather large claim, and also a very difficult thing to plug in. The better question is this: Could the island's sacred architecture have carried more layers of practical knowledge than we once assumed? Could the placement of statues and platforms have helped preserve seasonal, astronomical, navigational, or genealogical memory? Could ritual spaces also function as teaching spaces? Could a statue be both an ancestor and a marker, both sacred presence and part of a larger system of orientation? This is not as strange as it sounds. In many traditional societies, useful knowledge is not separated from sacred meaning, the way modern institutions often separate them. A calendar can be sacred, a route can be remembered through myth, a star path can be sung. A genealogy can encode rights to land and sea, a ceremony can teach younger generations when to plant, where to travel, which winds matter, and what dangers to avoid. The modern habit of sorting things into neat boxes, science over here, religion over there, geography in that drawer, music in another, can make older systems harder to understand. Rapa Nui may have held knowledge in a more braided way. Think of a family recipe passed down without ever being written. It tells you ingredients, timing, memory, family history, and sometimes who is allowed to stir the pot, which is apparently a matter of great seriousness in many kitchens. Now imagine that kind of layered knowledge, but expanded across an island. A platform marks an ancestor. That ancestor links to a lineage. The lineage links to a territory. The territory links to a spring, a garden, a fishing ground, a seasonal wind, a star rising, a route remembered from older voyages. The stone does not need to say all of this in a modern written sentence. It only needs to cue memory in the people trained to read it. The mystery deepens because Rapa Nui also had rongorongo, a system of glyphs carved on wooden tablets and other objects. It remains undeciphered. Nobody today can read it with certainty. That fact alone gives the island a feeling of unfinished conversation. Here is a culture that carved signs, preserved sequences, and clearly had some system of recording or structuring meaning, yet the key has been lost. When people suggest that Moai roads and platforms may have formed a broader archive, rongorongo becomes a tempting piece of the puzzle, not proof by itself, but a reminder that Rapa Nui knowledge was not only oral, not only carved in stone, and not only ceremonial. It may have moved through several forms at once. Then there are the stone hats, the pukau, placed on some moai. They were carved from red scoria and transported separately from the bodies. Many interpretations connect them to hair, status, or sacred power. But the more speculative AI reanalysis asks whether their placement, weight, colour, and shape might also have mattered in other ways. Did they change the visual role of the statue at sunrise or sunset? Did they alter how sound moved around certain platforms? Did they mark special figures linked to seasonal events, lineages, or navigational traditions? These are not settled answers. They are questions. But on an island where every major carving required labour, planning, and social meaning, it is reasonable to ask why certain statues received them and others did not. Sound is another quiet doorway into the story. The reference to resonance may sound modern, as if someone has brought a laboratory into a windswept sacred site and asked the stones to sing on command. But sound has always mattered in ritual spaces. Chants, drums, footsteps, wind, waves, and human voices can behave differently depending on shape, surface, and enclosure. Some ancient monuments around the world have acoustic effects that may have been noticed, valued, and used, even if not described in modern scientific language. On Rapa Nui, open platforms, stone surfaces, cliff edges, and statue arrangements may have shaped sound in ways that helped ceremony, memory, and group experience. A chant repeated before stone ancestors, carried by wind from the sea, would not simply be sound. It would be social glue. It would be teaching. It would be presence. And then there are the roads. Some old roads on Rapa Nui appear to connect quarries, platforms, and settlements. Many moai were moved from the quarry at Rano Raraku, where they were carved, to places around the island. The island is full of statues in different states of completion and movement, some still partly buried, some lying along routes, some standing where they were intended to stand. To the practical eye, roads are evidence of transport. To the symbolic eye, they may also be evidence of procession. To the AI-centered theory, they become lines in a possible network, routes along which stone figures moved, people gathered, stories were retold, and knowledge was reinforced by repetition. A road can move an object. It can also move memory. The quarry itself is one of the most remarkable places on the island. Rano Raraku, the volcanic crater from which most Moai were carved, is not just a source of stone. It feels almost like a place where the island is still, dreaming statues into being. Figures stand on the slopes, others remain attached to the rock, unfinished, as if work stopped only yesterday instead of centuries ago. If the island were a memory system, then the quarry would be more than a workshop. It would be the birthplace of signs. Each statue began there, took shape from the same volcanic body, and then travelled outward to its community. That movement from quarry to platform may have carried more than stone. It may have carried identity, authority, and encoded relationships across the island. Now, we should be gentle with the phrase AI discovered. It is a phrase that can become a little too excited for its own good, like a puppy that has found a sock and now believes it has solved archaeology. AI does not understand culture the way people do. It does not inherit oral traditions. It does not stand at a site and feel wind, smell salt, or listen to elders. What it can do is process large amounts of information quickly. It can compare distances, angles, shapes, alignments, and repeated features. It can suggest clusters that deserve human attention. Used carefully, it can become a tool. Used carelessly, it can become a very confident machine for producing attractive mistakes. So in this story, AI is not the wise old sage revealing a hidden truth while everyone gasps around a glowing screen. It is more like a new lens, and like any lens, it can clarify or distort. The value depends on how it is used, what data it receives, and whether its results are tested against archaeology, oral history, geology, astronomy, and the lived knowledge of Rapa Nui people. The most interesting possibility is not that AI replaces human interpretation. It is that AI notices a pattern, and human scholars then ask, carefully, patiently, whether that pattern belongs to the island's real history or only to the machine's imagination. In the reference idea for this journey, Grok AI supposedly compared surveys, astronomy, acoustics, statue orientations, roads, and rongorongo symbols, and found something unexpected. It suggested that the Moai and their settings may have formed a kind of ancient information network. A hidden data system, not electronic, not mechanical, but cultural and environmental. Solar calendars might have been marked by shadows and alignments. Ocean navigation routes might have been preserved through statue directions or platform relationships. Resonant sound patterns might have helped ritual chants carry meaning. Rongorongo symbols might have connected carved signs to a broader island memory. The result is not a simple answer. It is a web of possibility. The reason this idea feels compelling is that Rapa Nui itself already feels like a place built from memory. An island so remote needs memory. It needs memory of where water can be found, where crops grow, where fishing is safe, where the winds shift, when certain birds arrive, when ceremonies should happen, who belongs to which land, and how people remain connected to ancestors. On a continent, some knowledge can be replaced by movement. If one valley fails, another may be reached. On an island, memory is survival. Forgetting is not just sad, it can be dangerous. And perhaps that is why the Moai feel so different when we stop seeing them only as isolated statues. In photographs, they are often framed alone against the sky, like lonely giants lost in thought. But in their original context, they belong to communities and landscapes. They were part of a system of presence, their faces turned inward, toward the people, not out across the sea as many first imagine. That detail matters. They were not simply watching for invaders or staring into emptiness. They were facing the living, ancestors looking toward descendants. Stone memory turned toward daily life. If they also helped organize knowledge, then that knowledge was not distant and cold. It was not the kind of data stored in a forgotten folder with a name like Final Version, Final, really final. It was knowledge held in relationship. The statue sees the village, the platform holds the ancestors, the shadow moves with the season, the road remembers the journey, the chant fills the space, the glyph records a sequence nobody today can fully read. All of it together forms a landscape where meaning does not sit in one place. It moves between stone, body, sky, and memory. That is the story we're going to follow, not with a rush, and not with the need to force every stone into a secret code. We will move slowly around the island, looking first at the Moai themselves, then at the AI reanalysis and what it claims to have noticed. We will follow roads and platforms. We will consider sun and shadow. We will listen for the possibility of sound. We will look at Rongorongo, that quiet script still holding its tongue after all these years. And along the way we will keep one foot on solid ground and the other near the edge of mystery, which is probably the safest way to walk across ancient history without tripping over our own excitement. For now, imagine the evening settling over Rapa Nui. The sun lowers toward the Pacific. The grass moves in the wind. A line of Moai stands on its platform, their faces calm, their long noses and heavy brows catching the last light. Behind them, the ocean keeps breathing against the shore. Around them, shadows lengthen inch by inch, not randomly, but with the dependable patience of the sky. Somewhere in that movement, people once saw meaning. They may have seen ancestors, they may have seen status, they may have seen the order of the year, the memory of the sea, and the shape of knowledge carried from one generation to the next. The modern world arrives with satellites, drones, databases, machine learning models, and a habit of naming every mystery as if naming it were the same as solving it. But the island does not hurry. It has waited through storms, silence, damage, misunderstanding, and fascination. It has watched visitors come and go, each bringing new questions, new theories, new cameras, and occasionally new confidence that they are the first to truly understand. The Moai remain, the roads remain, the quarry remains, the signs remain unread. And beneath all of it is the possibility that Rapa Nui was never merely a place of stone faces, but a place where stone faces helped people remember how to live in the middle of the sea. That is where our path begins, on a remote island where memory may have taken the shape of giants, and where the oldest questions are not always answered by digging deeper, but sometimes by looking again, more carefully at what has been standing in plain sight all along. The next step is to walk closer to the statues themselves, not as symbols in a postcard, not as puzzles waiting to entertain us, but as the work of real people with real hands, real ancestors, real landscapes, and a world of meaning that may have been far more complex than the simple word monument can hold. Long before the world learned to call it Easter Island, and long before visitors arrived with cameras, maps, theories, and that particular human confidence that every mystery must surely be solved by lunchtime, Rapa Nui stood alone in the Pacific. It was not alone in the sense that nothing lived there. The island had people, birds, plants, gardens, fires, songs, quarrels, ceremonies, and ordinary days full of work that had to be done whether or not anyone in the future would find it mysterious. But it was alone in a geographical sense that is hard to truly feel from a map. On a screen, the island is just a tiny shape surrounded by blue. But in the real world, that blue is enormous. It is not a pond, it is not a channel, it is not even the kind of sea you can cross while keeping another coast somewhere in the back of your mind. It is thousands of kilometres of open ocean, spreading in every direction, with waves that rise and fall under the same sky for days, weeks, and generations. To reach such a place in the ancient world required more than luck. It required knowledge. The people who settled Rapa Nui came from the wider Polynesian world, a world of voyagers whose ancestors crossed the Pacific with a skill that still feels astonishing. They did not have metal compasses. They did not have printed charts folded badly in the bottom of a boat. They did not have satellites gently telling them to continue straight for 2,000 kilometers, then make a slight left at the next cloud. They had something older and in many ways more intimate. They had the stars, the swells, the winds, the habits of birds, the smell of weather, the shape of clouds over unseen land, and the memory of routes carried by trained navigators. They read the ocean the way other people read roads. So when we imagine the first settlers of Rapa Nui, we should not picture frightened wanderers accidentally bumping into an island at the edge of nowhere. We should picture skilled people entering a difficult world with courage, intention, and an inherited science of movement. Their arrival was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a long relationship with a small island that would demand careful living. Rapa Nui offered land, but not endless land. It offered stone, but not great forests forever. It offered soil, wind, fish, birds, volcanic slopes, caves, craters, and coastlines. But everything came with limits. On such an island, survival depended on memory. Where to plant, when to harvest, which places held water, which winds arrived in certain seasons, which fishing grounds were reliable, which ancestors held claim to which land, which stories explained how the living belonged where they stood. And then, out of that life, the Moai appeared. Even if you have only seen them in photographs, the Moai have a strange power. They do not perform, they do not leap dramatically from the landscape, waving their arms and asking to be understood. In fact, most of them have no visible arms at all, only long bodies with hands carved low across the belly. Yet they command attention through stillness. Their faces are long, heavy and solemn. Their brows are strong. Their noses fall in a straight line. Their mouths are thin and controlled, as if every statue knows something but has chosen not to interrupt. Some stand upright on ceremonial platforms, some lie fallen, some remain buried up to the neck on the slopes of the quarry. Some are unfinished, still attached to the volcanic rock from which they were being born. Taken together, they give the island the feeling of a place watched over by memory. The common image of the Moai is often a row of giant heads. That is one of the little misunderstandings the modern world carries around quite comfortably, like a souvenir bought in a hurry. Many of the statues are not only heads, they have full bodies, though erosion, burial and framing in popular photographs have made the heads seem separate. When archaeologists excavated around some of them, their torsos and carved hands emerge from the earth. It is a simple correction, but an important one. These were not random faces stuck into the ground. They were human-like figures, shaped with a clear sense of posture, presence, and relation to the living. Most Moai were carved from compressed volcanic ash at Reanalyzed, the great quarry on the side of a volcanic crater. If Rapa Nui is the heart of this mystery, then Reanalyzed is one of its deepest chambers. The place is filled with statues in different stages of existence. Some stand on the outer slopes, half buried by time and soil, staring out with a patience that makes a human lifespan feel very brief indeed. Others remain in the rock, unfinished, as though the carvers stepped away for a meal and never returned. One enormous statue still attached to the quarry would have been far larger than most that were ever transported. It lies there like an ambition too heavy for the world. Walking through the quarry, it is easy to understand why people have imagined it as a factory, a workshop, or a sacred birthplace. But perhaps none of those words is quite enough. It was a place where stone became ancestor, where geology became social memory, where a mountain slowly gave the island its faces. The work itself was extraordinary. The carvers used stone tools to cut and shape the volcanic tuff. This was not the hardest stone on the island, which helped make carving possible, but possible is not the same as easy. Anyone who has ever tried to assemble flat-pack furniture with the wrong screwdriver will understand that materials can be cooperative and still make you question your entire life. The Moai required planning, labour, skill, and social organisation. They had to be carved with enough detail to hold meaning, shaped with enough strength to survive transport, and separated from the quarry without breaking. Then many of them had to be moved across the island to platforms near communities. That movement alone has inspired decades of debate, experiment and fascination. How did people move them? For a long time, outsiders imagined enormous numbers of workers dragging statues on wooden sledges, perhaps using logs as rollers. Others argued for different systems of ropes, rocking motions, and careful coordinated movement. Some modern experiments have shown that upright statues can be made to walk by rocking them side to side with ropes, a method that fits certain oral traditions and the statue's forward-leaning shape during transport. The exact methods may have varied depending on statue size, route, and time period. What matters for our story is that the movement was not casual. A Moai did not simply appear at its platform because a few bored islanders had a free afternoon and thought, well, this should keep us busy until dinner. Moving one required people, rhythm, command, patience, and shared purpose. That shared purpose is the real beginning of understanding them. The Moai are usually linked to ancestors, and this idea matters deeply. They were not just decorations. They were not merely impressive objects built for the sake of impressiveness, though they certainly did that too. They are understood as representing powerful ancestral figures connected to lineage, authority, protection, and community identity. Many once stood on ahu, the stone platforms that served as ceremonial and social focal points. The statues generally faced inland toward the people and the settlements, rather than outward to the sea. This is one of the most important details in the whole landscape. To a casual visitor, it might seem natural for island statues to look toward the horizon, guarding the shore or watching for ships. But the Moai looked inward. Their gaze was directed toward the living. There is something quietly moving about that. These figures stood with their backs to the vast ocean and their faces toward the community. In a world where ancestry was not something tucked into a dusty family album, but a living source of identity and power, the statues made the past present. They turned genealogy into stone. They reminded people who they were, where they belonged, and whose authority shaped the land. The dead were not gone in the modern sense. They remained involved, watching, supporting, perhaps judging, depending on the day and how well everyone was behaving. Ancestors can be comforting, but one suspects they can also be rather difficult to impress. The eyes of some Moai add another layer. Restored examples show that at least some statues once had eyes made from white coral, with dark pupils of obsidian or red scoria. When these eyes were placed into the sockets, the statue's appearance changed dramatically. A stone face became a seeing presence. Without eyes, the Moai can seem inward, asleep, or unfinished. With eyes, they become alert. The act of adding eyes may have activated the figure in a ceremonial sense, giving it the power to look, to watch, to hold mana, that sacred force or spiritual authority often discussed in Polynesian contexts. Imagine a community gathering before a newly raised statue as its eyes were set in place. The stone that had been carved, moved, lifted and prepared now looked back. A figure of memory became a figure of presence. This is important because when we later consider the idea that the Moai may have been part of a broader information system, we must not strip away their sacred role. If they held knowledge, they did so as ancestors, not as cold markers in a mechanical grid. If they helped organise land, time or memory, that function would have been braided with identity, ceremony and belief. A modern road sign tells you where to turn. It does not usually remind you of your great-grandfather, settle questions of land inheritance and participate in seasonal ritual, although perhaps traffic would be more interesting if it did. The Moai belonged to a world where practical and sacred knowledge were not separate rooms. They lived together. The platforms, the ahu, give the statues their setting. An isolated Moai in a photograph can look like a lonely giant, But the Ahu reveal that the statues were part of built places. These platforms were carefully constructed, often near the coast, and connected with communities and territories. Some held multiple statues. Some were rebuilt or altered over time. Some incorporated cremation burials or other sacred features. Their positions around the island created a kind of ring of ancestral presence, not a perfect circle drawn with a compass, but a social and ceremonial geography. Each Ahu belonged somewhere. Each faced inward from its place. Each formed a point in the island's human landscape. And this is where loneliness becomes complicated. The Moai look lonely to us because we often see them after catastrophe, after many have fallen, after the society that built them has changed, after their original ceremonies were disrupted, after the voices that explained them were wounded by history. But when they stood in their active world, they were not lonely in that sense. They were surrounded by people. They were visited, seen, invoked, repaired, respected, perhaps feared. They were part of daily and ceremonial life. Their loneliness is partly ours. We see them across a gap. We cannot easily hear the chants that once sounded near them. We cannot ask the carver why a mouth was shaped that way, or why one ancestor deserved a statue larger than another. We stand in the silence left behind and call the statues silent, though perhaps they were once anything but. Still, there is a true loneliness in Rapa Nui's setting. The island's isolation shaped everything. A community living there could not depend on frequent outside contact. Over time, the island had to become a whole world. Its resources, its boundaries, its sacred places, and its memories had to carry enormous weight. In larger land masses, monuments may mark one place among many. On Rapa Nui, the entire island was a limited stage. Stone, soil, water, coastline and sky had to be known intimately. In that sense, the Moai may have helped anchor human meaning to a landscape that was both generous and unforgiving. They made belonging visible. The statues also tell us that the people of Rapa Nui were capable of long-term projects. A Moai could not be imagined, carved, moved, and raised without coordination. Someone had to decide where it would go. Someone had to organise labour. Someone had to feed workers. Someone had to know the route. Someone had to maintain the rituals and meanings that justified all that effort. Monuments like these are not just stone. They are frozen social energy. Every smooth surface and shaped brow contains hours of labour, argument, skill, food production, leadership and belief. If you listen carefully, a statue is not quiet at all. It is full of people. This is one reason the older stereotype of Rapa Nui as a place of simple collapse is too thin. For many years, popular stories presented the island as a cautionary tale of ecological self-destruction, where people cut down all their trees, destroyed their environment, and toppled into chaos. The real history is more complicated. Environmental change did happen, and deforestation was significant, but the causes and consequences are debated, and they include factors such as Polynesian rat activity, climate, land use, and later devastating outside contact. European arrival, disease, slave raids, forced removals, missionary pressures, and colonial exploitation caused enormous harm to the Rapa Nui people and their cultural continuity. To reduce everything to they destroyed themselves is not only simplistic, it misses the resilience, adaptation, and suffering imposed from outside. It is a story that needs more care than a tidy moral lesson allows. The Moai themselves sit at the centre of that care. At some point, many statues were toppled from their platforms. The reasons are still discussed, often connected to internal conflict, changes in religious practice, social stress, or shifts in power. A fallen Moai is a powerful sight. The face that once watched the living lies against the earth. The body is no longer upright. The presence has been interrupted. But even in falling, the statues remained meaningful. Broken sacred things do not become ordinary simply because they are damaged. They become reminders of change, grief, and transformation. Some Moai have been restored in modern times, standing again on their ahu. The most famous restored sites can create a feeling of timelessness, but restoration is never the same as returning the past exactly as it was. It is a modern act shaped by archaeology, conservation, politics, tourism, and cultural revival. The statues that stand today stand in several times at once. They belong to the ancient world that created them. They belong to the historical periods that damaged and misunderstood them. They belong to the living Rapa Nui community. They also belong, in a more complicated way, to a global imagination that keeps returning to them with questions. That is quite a lot of responsibility for a stone face, especially one that never asked to become an international symbol of mystery. Yet their fame can make them harder to see clearly. The Moai have become icons, and icons are often flattened by repetition. We see the long faces on travel posters, documentaries, puzzles, cartoons, and novelty mugs, and the very familiarity can dull the strangeness. But try to see one freshly, not as an image you already know, but as an object made by hands in a remote island society centuries ago. Look at the elongated head, the heavy brow, the carved ears, the long torso, the hands resting across the stomach. Think of the quarry where the stone was cut. Think of the route across rough volcanic ground. Think of the people pulling ropes, chanting, balancing, correcting. Think of the platform waiting near a community. Think of the eyes being placed. Think of the first sunrise after the statue stood complete. Suddenly the Moai is not a symbol, it is an event. And that event may have repeated across the island in different forms for generations. Each new statue added another ancestor to the visible world. Each ahu strengthened a link between people, land, and lineage. Each figure created a point of memory. When we speak later of data systems or ancient archives, this is the foundation. Not a hidden code imposed from outside, but a landscape already rich with structured meaning. The Moai did not need to be mysterious machines to carry information. Their basic cultural role already involved storing and transmitting knowledge. Who mattered? Who belonged? Where authority rested? What places were sacred? How the living related to the dead? The question raised by the AI reanalysis is whether that role extended into patterns we have not fully recognized. If an ancestor statue stood in a certain place, facing a certain direction, near a certain route, with a certain relation to sunrise or other platforms, did that arrangement teach more than lineage? Did it help mark seasonal time? Did it encode connections between communities? Did it preserve voyaging memory? Did it create a kind of map that was not meant to be read by strangers from the sky, but by islanders moving through the landscape with stories in mind? The possibility is not that every statue points to a secret star or every road hides a message. That would be too easy, and ancient people were rarely so considerate as to arrange their worlds for future documentaries. The possibility is subtler. Meaning may have lived in combinations. A Moai alone tells one kind of story. A Moai on an ahu facing inland tells another. A line of aua around the island tells another. A road from quarry to platform adds movement. A seasonal shadow adds time. A chant adds memory. A rongorongo glyph, if connected through ritual or teaching, adds sequence. Together these things might form a web of knowledge. Not a code in the modern puzzle box sense, but a system of reminders. In societies with strong oral traditions, memory often works through place. A path is not merely walked, it is narrated. A stone is not merely seen, it is named. A hill is not merely a hill, it is part of a story, a boundary, a lesson, a warning, a genealogy. The land becomes a library because people know how to read it. This idea becomes even more plausible when we remember how Polynesian navigation worked. Wayfinding across the Pacific depended on memory systems of extraordinary sophistication. Navigators learned star paths, swell patterns, island sequences and signs of landfall. Much of this knowledge was taught orally and practically. through repetition and embodied experience. It was not written down in the way a modern sailing manual is written, yet it was precise. A navigator did not need a paper chart if the chart lived in trained memory, song and sky. On Rapa Nui, a remote endpoint of that voyaging world, it is possible that memory of the wider ocean remained important long after settlement. The Moai, facing inward, may not have been looking out to guide canoes, but the culture that made them came from people who knew how to turn the world into orientation. What would loneliness mean to such people? Perhaps not abandonment. Perhaps attention. Living on an isolated island makes the horizon a constant presence. It surrounds every field, every ceremony, every argument over food, every child learning the names of ancestors. The sea is always there, not merely as scenery, but as boundary, road, danger, and memory. The Moai stand at the edge of that world, often near the coast, with their backs toward the vastness and their faces toward human life. They make a statement without words. Here is the sea behind us. Here are the people before us. Here is the line between what came from elsewhere and what must endure here. There is something deeply human in that arrangement. All communities need ways to hold themselves together. Some build walls, some write laws, some keep archives, some maintain temples, songs, or graves. Rapa Nui built ancestors in stone. The statues gave shape to continuity. They said, in a language of posture and presence, that the living were not alone. Even at the edge of the Pacific, surrounded by impossible distances, they stood within a chain of memory. The ancestors were there. The land was known. The sky could be watched. The roads could be walked. The island, though small, was full of meaning. That meaning may help explain why the Moai continue to affect people who know very little about them. A visitor may not understand the lineages, ceremonies, or histories, but the emotional message of the statue still arrives. They feel like memory made visible. They feel like something waiting. Their size helps, of course. Humans are easily impressed by large stone things. Put a large enough stone in a field, and someone will eventually whisper, "Ancient mystery," even if it is only a very ambitious garden ornament. But the Moai are not powerful merely because they are large. They are powerful because they combine scale with human likeness and restraint. They do not roar, they endure. Endurance, though, can be misleading. Stone lasts longer than people, but it does not explain itself. The Moai have survived in ways their original meanings have not fully survived. Some knowledge remains in Rapa Nui traditions, scholarship and cultural practice. Some has been damaged or lost. Some is still debated. That is why every new theory must be handled carefully. The island is not an empty puzzle waiting for outsiders to solve. It is a homeland with living descendants, a history of harm, and sacred places that deserve respect. Any AI model, researcher, writer, or curious listener must remember that. The mystery belongs not only to the past, but to people in the present. At the same time, respectful curiosity can deepen appreciation. Asking whether the Moai formed part of a wider memory system does not reduce them, if asked carefully. It may expand them. It allows us to imagine that these figures were not only portraits of ancestors, not only political symbols, not only ritual presences, but also nodes in a landscape of knowledge. A statue could mark a lineage and participate in a calendar. A platform could hold the dead and align with a seasonal event. A road could move stone and teach geography. A ceremonial gathering could honour ancestors and reinforce navigation, planting, or social order. Human cultures often build such layers naturally. We are the ones who later separate them. Picture a child on Rapa Nui centuries ago walking with elders near an ahu. The child sees the statue first as a face, then learns its name, then learns whose ancestor it represents, then learns what land it watches, which families gather there, which ceremonies happen in its presence, perhaps which stars or seasons matter when standing in that place. The knowledge comes slowly, not as a lecture with bullet points, thank goodness, but as repeated experience. The same place visited in different seasons, the same statue seen in morning light and evening shadow, the same stories heard until they become part of the landscape. By adulthood, the child does not just know the island. The child belongs to an island arranged by memory. This is why the Moai at the edge of the Pacific are lonely only from a distance. Come closer, and they are crowded with relationships, ancestors and descendants, quarries and roads, platforms and houses, coast and inland fields, stone and sky, oral tradition and carved sign, human labour and volcanic earth. Their silence is not emptiness. It is the silence of something that once spoke through a whole culture, not through a single sentence. As night comes over the island, the statues change. Their faces lose detail. Their bodies become dark shapes against the fading sky. The ocean keeps moving behind them, carrying swells from distances no one can see. Stars begin to appear, the same kind of stars that once guided canoes across the Pacific. In that quiet, it becomes easier to understand why a remote island society might build such presences. Not because they had nothing better to do, not because they were obsessed with stone for its own sake, but because in a place surrounded by vastness, memory needed anchors. The Moai were anchors of ancestry, identity, land, and perhaps more forms of knowledge than we have yet learned to recognise. And this brings us toward the strange new question raised by the AI reanalysis. Once we stop seeing the Moai as isolated wonders and begin seeing them as part of a connected island landscape, new possibilities emerge. Their placement, their orientation, their relationship to roads and platforms, their link to the quarry, their role in ceremony, even the way they watch the living from the edge of the sea, all of it begins to look less like a scattered collection of monuments and more like a network of meaning. Whether that network encoded calendars, sea routes, sound patterns, or something still harder to name is not something we can assume too quickly. But it is something worth approaching with care, because sometimes the unexpected discovery is not that ancient people hid knowledge from us, but that they placed it exactly where it needed to be, in plain sight, for those who knew how to look. When the modern world looks at an ancient island, it brings modern habits with it. It brings drones, databases, satellite maps, three-dimensional scans, statistical models, and a deep, slightly suspicious belief that if enough information is placed into a machine, the machine might blink politely and hand back a secret. This is where Grok AI enters our story. Not as a magician with a glowing robe, and certainly not as an archaeologist with dusty boots and sunburned shoulders, but as a new kind of tool. A tool that can look at many pieces of evidence at once and ask whether the island's famous stone faces were part of a pattern larger than anyone had expected. At first, that sounds almost too dramatic. The Moai reanalyzed by artificial intelligence, hidden meanings decoded, ancient data system uncovered. It has the flavour of a headline that arrives very excited and perhaps should be offered a cup of tea until it calms down. But beneath the excitement is a real and interesting question. What happens when we stop looking at the Moai one by one and begin looking at them together? What happens when the quarry, the roads, the Ahu platforms, the orientations, the sunlight, the coastline, the old settlements, the stone hats, the acoustic spaces, and the mysterious Rongorongo signs are treated not as separate puzzles, but as parts of one connected landscape? That is the kind of question a machine can help ask. Not answer completely, not with wisdom, not with cultural memory, and not with the human feeling of standing before a statue in the salt wind. But it can ask in its own strange way. It can measure. It can compare. It can search for repetition. It can notice that certain lines, angles, distances or clusters appear again and again. It can hold thousands of details in view at once without needing a snack, a nap, or a long walk around the room because the map has become too confusing. And in a place like Rapa Nui, where meaning may be spread across the land rather than written in a single surviving book, that kind of comparison becomes tempting. The idea behind this reanalysis is simple enough to say and difficult enough to prove. Suppose the Moai were not arranged only as independent ancestor figures. Suppose each one still carried that sacred role, but also helped form a larger memory network. A statue might belong to a lineage, stand on a platform, face a settlement, mark a territory, align with a seasonal sunrise, connect to a road from the quarry, and sit within sight or memory of other places on the island. One statue alone might not reveal much beyond its local meaning, but many statues together might show repeated relationships. The pattern may not be in the stone face alone, it may be in the space between faces. This is the kind of thing human beings can miss because we are very good at close attention and very bad at holding everything in our heads at once. An archaeologist may spend years studying one site, one platform, one set of artifacts, one excavation trench, and that careful work is essential. But an island-wide pattern can hide in plain sight simply because it is too large to notice from ground level. It is a little like standing inside a huge painting with your nose close to one brush stroke. You can learn a great deal about the pigment, the texture, the hand that made it, and whether someone really should have cleaned the brush first, but you cannot see the whole image until you step back. AI is, in some ways, a tool for stepping back. It can take maps of Moai locations and compare them with old pathways, coastal features, water sources, likely settlement zones, and astronomical events. It can examine whether certain platforms cluster near resources, whether statue orientations repeat across different territories, whether roads follow practical routes only, or whether they also create ceremonial lines of movement. It can test whether some alignments are more common than chance would suggest. It can build models, discard weak patterns, highlight strong ones, and occasionally become overconfident in a way that feels oddly human. That last part matters. AI does not know when it is being poetic. It does not know when a line on a map feels meaningful because it is truly cultural, or because human beings love straight lines, triangles, and anything that seems to whisper hidden code. It does not know the difference between an ancestral platform and a modern tourist path unless someone has given it careful data. It does not know which traditions are sacred, which places should not be treated casually, or which questions require permission from living communities. It can produce patterns, but people must judge whether those patterns belong to history. So the more careful version of the claim is not that Grok AI solved Rapa Nui. It did not march onto the island, adjust a digital hat, and announce that the Moai was secretly a stone computer. The more careful version is that an AI-style reanalysis might reveal relationships worth investigating. It might notice repeated orientations. It might suggest that certain Ahu platforms relate to solar events. It might point out that roads, statue positions, and landscape features form clusters that look intentional. It might connect old survey data to new questions. It might help researchers ask whether the island's architecture carried layers of knowledge beyond the obvious. And the obvious is already impressive. The Moai represented ancestors. The Ahu platforms anchored communities. The quarry at Reanalyzed produced the great stone figures. The roads carried statues outward. The coastline shaped settlement. The stars and sun mattered to Polynesian life. None of this requires a hidden code. But the interesting possibility is that these known things may have worked together in a more structured way than a simple monument-by-monument view can show. Imagine feeding the system a map of the island. First, it sees Reanalyzed, the quarry where most of the Moai were carved. Then it sees the routes spreading outward, with statues abandoned or left along the way. Then it sees the Ahu platforms near the coast, many positioned around the island like points in a broken necklace. Then it sees that the statues mostly face inland toward the communities they watched. Then it adds the rise and fall of the sun through the year. It marks solstices, equinoxes, and seasonal angles of light. It checks where shadows would fall at certain times. It compares one platform to another. It looks at sight lines, distances, and directions. It does not get tired. It does not say, "That is enough ancient stone geometry for one evening." It keeps going. From that kind of analysis, the theory suggests that some arrangements may have acted as seasonal markers, not in the way a modern printed calendar tells you that Thursday is bin day and you have once again forgotten to put the bins out. Ancient calendars were often tied to places, shadows, ceremonies, and recurring events in nature. A sunrise over a certain ridge, a shadow touching a stone, a star appearing before dawn, a bird returning, a wind shifting. These signs helped people organize planting, harvesting, fishing, ritual, and social gatherings. If certain Moai or Ahu mark these cycles, they would not stop being sacred ancestor monuments. They would become sacred ancestor monuments that also helped people keep time. That is not strange in an ancient context. Across the world, many monuments combine ceremony with observation. A sacred site can also be a calendar. A tomb can also frame sunlight. A temple can also align with a solstice. A stone circle can be both a gathering place and a sky-watching tool. Modern people sometimes ask whether such sites were religious or scientific, but that question may say more about us than about the builders. For the people who made them, the movement of the sun and the authority of the ancestors might have belonged to the same world. The sky did not need to be separated from belief. Time did not need to be separated from ceremony. Knowledge did not need to wear a lab coat to be real. The AI-centered theory also looks toward navigation. This is where Rapa Nui becomes even more interesting, because the island's people belong to the wider Polynesian voyaging tradition. Their ancestors crossed huge distances by reading the ocean and sky. Navigation was not just a practical skill, it was cultural inheritance. It involved memory, training, status, and survival. If any place on Earth might preserve knowledge through route, direction, and landscape memory, a remote Polynesian island is a reasonable place to look. But how could statues facing inland preserve ocean knowledge? That question sounds like a problem at first. If the Moai were about navigation, why are they not all staring dramatically out to sea, perhaps with one stone eyebrow raised toward the next island? The answer may be that navigation knowledge does not always need to be displayed as an outward-pointing arrow. It can be embedded in relationships. A platform may align with a star path remembered in chant. A statue may stand in a territory associated with a lineage that held a knowledge of a route. A road may connect ceremonial movement with stories of arrival. A sequence of places around the island may teach directions, winds, or ancestral journeys. The Moai could face the living because the living were the ones who needed to remember. In this view, the island becomes a memory palace. A memory palace is a method in which information is tied to imagined or real places so it can be recalled in order. Ancient speakers used it to remember long speeches. Traditional cultures around the world have used landscape as a memory system, tying songs, laws, routes, and histories to rocks, hills, rivers, and paths. You walk through the place, and the place reminds you what to say, what to teach, what to do. Rapa Nui may have functioned in a similar way, but with stone ancestors acting as especially powerful memory anchors. Each Moai could mark not just a person, but a cluster of knowledge associated with that person, place, and community. This does not mean every statue had a hidden label attached to it saying, "Please turn left at the third star after midnight." Ancient knowledge rarely works with such helpful neatness. It means the arrangement may have guided trained memory. Outsiders looking at the stones would see silent figures. Islanders raised within the system may have seen relationships. One platform recalls a lineage, another recalls a ceremony, a road recalls transport from the quarry, a shadow recalls a season, a chant recalls a voyage, a carved glyph recalls a sequence. The data is not sitting in one object. It is distributed across experience. That word, distributed, is useful. Modern computers can store information across networks. A single file may depend on many parts communicating. The Rapa Nui theory borrows that idea loosely, not to suggest electronics, but to describe a landscape where meaning was not centralized. There may not have been one archive building, one master tablet, one priestly handbook, or one carved explanation that said, Here is how the island works. Please return after reading. Instead, knowledge may have been spread through statues, platforms, roads, songs, rituals, and trained human memory. The system worked because people knew how to use it. When the culture was disrupted, the system became harder to read. The stones remained, but the instructions faded. That is one of the saddest possibilities in archaeology. A monument can survive while the knowledge that animated it disappears. The object remains visible, even famous, but the meaning becomes partial. Imagine finding a smartphone 1,000 years from now, with no electricity, no network, and no one who remembers what a password was. The object might look sleek and important. Scholars might argue over whether it was a mirror, a status charm, a religious tablet, or a small dark rectangle used to summon anxiety. They might be partly right, but the living system around it would be gone. Rapa Nui's stones are not phones, of course, and were not dependent on hidden batteries, which is probably for the best. But the comparison helps us understand how a system can be misunderstood when only its durable parts survive. Rongorongo deepens that feeling. The carved signs remain undeciphered, and that undeciphered quality makes them almost magnetic. They are proof that Rapa Nui had a form of recorded sign sequence, whether script, proto-writing, mnemonic device, sacred notation, genealogy, chant aid, or something still debated. If an AI model compares Rongorongo patterns with statue locations, seasonal cycles, or island geography, it may find echoes, repeated shapes, possible sequences, symbols that seem to correspond perhaps with birds, humans, plants, celestial forms, or ritual ideas. But this is very dangerous ground for overinterpretation. An undeciphered sign can become whatever a hopeful reader wants it to become. It is a mirror that invites imagination. AI may be even more vulnerable to this if given incomplete or biased data. A careful approach would not claim that Rongorongo has suddenly been decoded because a machine noticed similarities. It would say that the signs may have belonged to the same world of structured memory as the statues and platforms. They may have helped preserve chants, genealogies, calendars, or ceremonial sequences. If their patterns line up with island features, that might be worth studying. But a true decipherment requires repeated, testable relationships between signs and meanings, not just an attractive resemblance between one glyph and one idea. Otherwise, we are not reading the past, we are decorating it. The same caution applies to acoustics. The claim that certain platforms or statue arrangements produced resonant effects is fascinating. Sound matters in ritual. Chants before stone figures, voices carried by wind, drums or percussive movement, waves striking nearby cliffs, all of these could shape experience. If AI analysis used landscape models to detect places where sound might travel unusually well, or where stone surfaces might reflect voices in distinctive ways, that could be meaningful. A ceremonial space that enhances sound can make ritual more powerful and memory easier to preserve. Anyone who has ever hummed in a tiled bathroom and briefly believed they had become a professional singer understands the emotional power of acoustics, though perhaps the neighbours understand it differently. But again, sound is difficult to reconstruct. The island has changed. Stones have fallen or been restored. Vegetation has shifted. Modern noise exists. Wind varies. Human gatherings alter acoustics. Still, the possibility should not be dismissed too quickly. Oral traditions depend on performance. Performance depends on bodies in space. If certain ahu made chants carry clearly, if some spaces created echo or resonance, if the presence of moai gave voice a different feeling, then sound could have been part of the archive. Knowledge is easier to remember when it is sung, repeated, embodied, and tied to place. The island may have stored information not just in what people saw, but in what they heard. The redstone hats, or pukao, add another set of variables. In AI terms, they are features to compare. Which statues have them? Where are those statues located? Do they cluster at certain platforms? Do they relate to status, chronology, territory, or direction? Do they change the profile of a statue against the sky at sunrise or sunset? Their red colour may have carried symbolic meaning, perhaps linked to hair, rank, sacred force, or other cultural associations, but their distribution may also reveal patterns. AI can compare these patterns without becoming distracted by how visually striking they are, which is useful because humans are easily distracted by striking hats. This is true in archaeology and at weddings. If the pukao marked special figures, then those figures may have held special roles in the memory network. Perhaps they identified important ancestors. Perhaps they marked platforms linked to major ceremonies. Perhaps they emphasized particular territories. Perhaps, in the speculative version, they identified key nodes in a calendar or navigational system. The point is not to decide too quickly. The point is to notice that every added feature required labour. A pukao was not casual. It had to be quarried, shaped, moved, lifted and placed. That effort suggests meaning. The AI question is whether the meaning can be partly read through distribution. The roads may be even more revealing. From above, old roads and statue routes can be compared in ways difficult to understand from the ground. Some routes connect Reanalyzed to distant Ahu. Some fallen or abandoned statues lie along these paths. Were they simply transport roads? Very likely, at least in part. But transport can become ritual. Moving a statue from the quarry to its platform may have been a sacred journey. People may have gathered, chanted, pulled ropes, guided the figure, watched it lean and sway, corrected its path, and remembered the route afterward. A road used once for moving stone could become a remembered line of ancestral movement. Repeated over generations, such routes could structure the island's social geography. AI can examine whether the roads follow the easiest paths, the most direct paths, or something more complex. If some routes seem impractical by purely engineering standards, that does not prove hidden meaning, but it opens a question. Human beings do not always choose the easiest route when ceremony is involved. Processions often take meaningful paths, not efficient ones. Anyone who has watched a parade turn a 10-minute walk into a 2-hour event with drums will understand this. Movement itself can be the message. On Rapa Nui, the movement of Moai may have taught the island how its communities related to the quarry, to each other, and to the ancestors. So what did Grok AI supposedly find that felt unexpected? In this telling, it did not find one dramatic key. It found convergence. The same places that mattered for ancestry also seemed to matter for solar observation. The same routes that moved statues also linked meaningful nodes. The same platforms that held ceremonial presence also fit into wider spatial relationships. The same carved signs that resisted reading may have belonged to a larger habit of encoding memory through sequence and place. In other words, the Moai were not simple monuments standing in isolation. They may have been part of an island-scale system for organising knowledge. This is a subtle but important shift. It does not make the statues less human. It makes them more human. Modern people sometimes assume that practical knowledge and sacred art must be separate, as if ancient builders had to choose between making a calendar or honouring an ancestor. But human societies often do both at once. A church bell can call people to prayer and tell the hour. A festival can honour a deity and mark the agricultural year. A grave marker can preserve a name, a family line, a date, and a claim to memory. A song can entertain, teach, warn, and preserve a map. Why should the Moai have only one meaning? The difficulty is that modern analysis can easily become too hungry. Once a possible pattern appears, every detail starts looking intentional. A statue leans, and suddenly it points to a star. A road bends, and suddenly it encodes an ocean current. A bird glyph appears, and suddenly it becomes a secret astronomical formula. That is how serious inquiry slips into fantasy without noticing. The safer path is slower. Ask what evidence supports the pattern. Ask whether the pattern repeats. Ask whether it fits known Rapa Nui culture. Ask whether there are alternative explanations. Ask whether living Rapa Nui voices have been included. Ask whether the AI was trained on reliable data or fed a stew of old maps, tourist diagrams, and enthusiastic speculation. A machine can only be as careful as the people guiding it. And yet, even with all that caution, the idea remains powerful, because Rapa Nui is exactly the kind of place where knowledge would need to be layered. An isolated island community could not afford forgetfulness. It needed to hold ancestry, territory, seasonal timing, food systems, water knowledge, ritual authority, and perhaps memory of the wider ocean. Stone was durable. Ceremony was repeatable. Roads were walkable. Stars were dependable. Songs could carry information across generations. If these elements were woven together, then the island may indeed have functioned as a kind of living archive. Not an archive in the quiet modern sense with dust, folders, and someone gently reminding you not to use pens near the documents. A living archive is different. It is activated by people. It exists when elders teach, when ceremonies happen, when children ask questions, when walkers follow paths, when voices repeat names, when shadows fall at the right time of year and someone knows why. Without people, the archive becomes stone and silence. With people, it becomes knowledge. This may be the most important thing the AI reanalysis can teach us, even if some of its specific claims remain uncertain. It reminds us to look for systems, not just objects. The Moai are easier to photograph than relationships. A statue fits neatly in a frame. A network does not. But ancient life was made of relationships. A platform meant little without the community around it. A road meant little without movement. A glyph meant little without someone trained to read or recite it. A shadow meant little without a season and a memory attached to it. The pattern was not hidden because the builders tried to trick the future. It was hidden because the future lost the habits needed to see it. There is something humbling in that. We often imagine ourselves as the clever ones, arriving late with technology to explain what earlier people only half understood. But perhaps the deeper truth is that earlier people understood their own world in ways we've forgotten how to notice. AI may help us map the stones, but it does not automatically make us wiser than the people who placed them. It may reveal that the island had structure, but the structure belonged to human minds, hands, ceremonies, and memories long before it belonged to a machine's output. The tool is new. The intelligence that shaped the landscape was ancient. As we stand at this point in the story, the Moai begin to change again. They are still ancestors. They are still monuments. They are still products of extraordinary carving and transport. But now they also begin to look like points in a larger design. Not a design that must be forced into a single secret code, but a design made from repeated choices. Where to carve, where to move, where to raise, which direction to face, which platform to rebuild, which statue to crown with red stone, which ceremonies to perform, which stories to attach to which place. Over time, those choices could create a system, even if no one ever called it one. And this brings us toward the island's roads, platforms, and geometry. If Grok AI's most interesting suggestion is that the pattern was hidden in plain sight, then the next step is to look at the physical layout of Rapa Nui more closely. The island is not a blank surface with statues placed randomly upon it. It is a volcanic landscape shaped by craters, slopes, coastlines, resources, settlements, and sacred roots. The Moai do not float above that landscape. They belong to it. Their meaning may lie not only in their faces but in their positions, their distances, their paths, and the strange geometry formed when human memory met stone at the edge of the Pacific. To understand why the island's layout began to look so unusual under modern analysis, we have to leave the statues for a little while and look at the ground beneath them. Not just the ground in the simple sense of soil, rock, grass, and the occasional place where a careless visitor might wish they had worn better shoes, but the ground as a designed landscape. Rapa Nui was not a blank island with a few impressive stone figures scattered around for dramatic effect. It was a lived-in world shaped by movement, memory, territory, ceremony, and repeated human choices. The Moai were the most visible signs of those choices, but they were not alone. Beneath and around them were platforms, roads, quarries, settlements, gardens, caves, coastlines, and old lines of connection that made the island feel less like a collection of monuments and more like a carefully woven map. The Ahu platforms are the first things to notice. A Moai standing without its Ahu is like a sentence pulled out of a paragraph. You can still see something powerful, but the full meaning has been interrupted. The Ahu were the ceremonial platforms on which many Moai stood, often near the coast, facing inland toward the communities connected to them. Some were long and low, some were built, rebuilt, expanded and reused across generations. Some held one statue, others held several. They were not just stone bases, the ancient version of a display shelf, though admittedly a display shelf for a 12-ton ancestor would have been a very serious piece of furniture. They were sacred structures, social markers, burial places, territorial anchors, and stages for ceremony. They gave the statues their place in the human world. When we look at the Ahu around the island, a pattern begins to appear. Many are positioned near the coast, but their statues usually face away from the sea and toward the land. This creates a fascinating tension. The platforms stand near the edge, close to the boundary between island and ocean, but the figures turn their attention inward. It is as if the Ahu create a ring of ancestral presence around the human landscape. The sea lies behind them, immense and unknowable. The villages, fields and people lie before them, so the platform becomes a threshold. It stands between ocean memory and island life, between the world from which the ancestors came and the land where their descendants remained. In a simple map, these platforms can look like points, but in a lived landscape, points are never just points. Each Ahu belonged to a place. It sat within a territory, near resources, near paths, near settlements, and within the memory of a particular group. Its location may have reflected lineage claims, access to land, ritual importance, and practical needs. If you were raised on the island, you would not see an Ahu as a dot in a database. You would know its name, its people, its stories, perhaps its quarrels, and certainly whether you were supposed to behave respectfully near it. That kind of knowledge is difficult to represent on a modern map, but it is the very material from which ancient landscapes were made. This is where AI reanalysis becomes both useful and dangerous. Useful because a machine can compare many points at once. Dangerous because a machine may see geometry where culture saw relationship, or culture where erosion and chance have left their marks. When Grok AI is imagined as reanalyzing the island, it is not simply looking for whether one Ahu lines up with one sunrise, or whether one road points neatly toward one statue. It is looking for repeated relationships. How far are platforms from one another? Do certain groups share similar orientations? Do old roads connect them in ways that suggest more than transport? Do some positions relate to land divisions, water access, solar events, or lines of sight? Are there clusters that seem meaningful when overlaid with archaeology, topography, and tradition? This kind of analysis does not create certainty by itself. A map can be persuasive, especially when decorated with lines, dots, and enough arrows to make anyone feel that a secret is surely nearby. But real interpretation needs patience. Ancient people did not build places so that future software could draw beautiful diagrams. They built them for living purposes, with meanings rooted in their own society. Still, when patterns repeat, and when those patterns fit known cultural concerns, they become worth following. And on Rapa Nui, many of the concerns that might produce meaningful geometry are already present. Ancestry, territory, seasonal timing, movement from quarry to platform, and the memory of oceanic navigation. The roads are perhaps the most evocative part of this geometry. Some routes stretch outward from Rano Raraku, the quarry where most Moai were carved. Along certain roads, statues lie fallen or abandoned, as if caught mid-journey. For a long time, these roads were discussed mainly as transport routes. That is sensible. If you carve a large stone figure in one place and need it to stand somewhere else, a route between the two is not exactly optional. Even ancient logistics had to obey the basic rule that large objects do not usually move themselves unless someone has invented a very surprising kind of stone. But roads can be more than practical corridors. They can be ceremonial paths. They can be memory lines. They can turn movement into meaning. Imagine the journey of a Moai from the quarry to its ahu. The statue begins as part of the volcanic slope, cut from the same stone body as hundreds of others. Then it is shaped, separated, prepared, and moved. Whether it was dragged, rocked, walked upright with ropes, or transported by methods that varied over time, the movement required people working together. Such a journey would not have been quiet in the ordinary sense. There may have been chanting, instruction, shouting, adjustment, pauses, ritual acts, and the collective tension that comes when many people are trying to move something very large and nobody wants to be remembered as the person who let the ancestor fall on a Tuesday. The road was part of the transformation. The statue left the quarry as a carved body and arrived at its platform as a presence ready to be raised, activated, and connected to a community. If a community repeated such journeys over generations, the routes themselves could become charged with memory. People would remember where a statue paused, where another fell, where a difficult slope had to be crossed, where a group gathered, where an older road bent around rough ground, where stories were told to children following behind. The road would not only connect two locations, it would connect stages in a ritual process. That matters for the AI theory because roads might preserve relationships invisible if we treat them as mere engineering lines. Their geometry may reflect movement, ceremony, and social memory all at once. The strange thing about Rapa Nui's road system is that it draws the quarry into the whole island. Rano Raraku becomes the source, and the roots extend outward like veins or roots. Nearly all Moai begin in one place, yet many end in different territories. This creates a powerful island-wide relationship. Communities may have had their own platforms, ancestors, and lands, but the stone bodies of those ancestors came from the same volcanic source. The quarry was shared, sacred, central, and productive. In that sense, it may have acted almost like a heart. The statues moved outward from it, carrying stone memory into the island's many social worlds. Now, if we step back even farther, as AI mapping allows us to do, the island starts to look less like a random arrangement and more like a network. Ahu platforms near the coast, roads radiating from the quarry, statues placed along routes or raised at endpoints, settlements and gardens inland, caves and water sources in specific zones, craters marking the high points of the island's volcanic body. Each piece has its own explanation, but together they form an island-scale structure. The difficulty is deciding whether that structure is simply the natural result of geography and social life, or whether it also encoded deliberate knowledge in a more formal way. One possibility is that the platforms help define territories. Each Ahu may have marked the authority and ancestry of a group. Standing near the coast, facing inland, the Moai watched over the lands associated with their descendants. In that sense, the geometry of the platforms was political and genealogical. It described who belonged where. It made invisible relationships visible. Boundaries, claims, responsibilities, and histories were not written on paper. They were held in stone, ceremony, and memory. A person walking the island would know when they were near the place of one lineage or another. The landscape itself taught social order. Another possibility, which does not cancel the first, is that the Ahu and Moai helped organise time. A platform's position might relate to sunrise or sunset at certain times of year. Shadows cast by statues could fall in noticeable ways. Lines between platforms and landscape features might correspond to seasonal events. This does not mean every Ahu was an observatory, as if each ancestral platform came with a little sign saying, "Please stand here at dawn for astronomical service." but some places may have been chosen or used because of how they interacted with the sky. In a farming society, seasonal timing mattered. In a ritual society, celestial events mattered. In a Polynesian voyaging tradition, the sky mattered deeply. The same platform could hold ancestry and help mark time. This is one of the reasons the word geometry should be used carefully. We often hear geometry and imagine abstract shapes, perfect angles, clean diagrams, and perhaps a school exercise that made everyone briefly question the meaning of triangles. But ancient landscape geometry is not always about mathematical perfection. It is often about meaningful orientation. A place faces another place. A path follows a remembered route. A line of sight catches sunrise between two features. A platform is placed where people can gather, see, hear, and remember. The geometry is practical, sacred, and social. It is not floating above the island. It is walked, seen, and lived. The AI reanalysis becomes interesting when it suggests that these lived relationships may have produced patterns too consistent to ignore. For example, if several important ahu share alignments connected to solstice or equinox sunrises, that could suggest a seasonal layer. If roads not only connect quarry and platforms, but also pass through zones that mark older ceremonial or territorial relationships, that could suggest memory paths. If the spacing between certain platforms reflects social divisions or repeated measurement habits, that could suggest planned organisation. If some statue orientations cluster around inland features rather than simply facing settlements, that could raise new questions about what those features meant. None of these possibilities alone proves an ancient data system. Together they create a richer way of seeing. The phrase hidden in plain sight fits because nothing being discussed is invisible. The platforms are there, the roads are there, the quarry is there, the coast is there, the statues are there, even when fallen or damaged. What is hidden is the relationship among them. This is often how ancient systems become mysterious. The pieces survive separately, but the rules that connected them are damaged by time. A visitor sees stone. A descendant may preserve parts of tradition. An archaeologist records a structure. A machine finds a cluster. But the complete living grammar of the landscape, the way a trained person once moved through it and understood it, may no longer be fully recoverable. That loss can make us too quick to invent. When meaning is missing, imagination rushes in like water through a cracked wall. Suddenly every distance becomes sacred, every direction intentional, every curve a message. But the opposite mistake is also possible. We can become so cautious that we flatten the past into the simplest explanation and miss the sophistication of ancient systems. Rapa Nui deserves neither fantasy nor dismissal. It deserves careful wonder. It deserves the willingness to ask whether its builders arranged the island with layers of meaning, while also admitting that not every attractive pattern is real. Consider the ahu as nodes. In a modern network, a node is a point where information, energy, or connection passes through. On Rapa Nui, an ahu could be a node in several overlapping networks. It connected the living to ancestors. It connected a community to land. It connected local identity to island-wide quarry origins. It connected ceremonies to time. It connected roads to gathering places. It connected memory to stone. If a Moai stood on that ahu, the node gained a face, a body, a presence. The platform was no longer just a place. It became someone, or at least the visible form of someone remembered and empowered. This is where the idea of an ancient data system becomes more reasonable if we soften the modern wording. Data does not have to mean numbers in a spreadsheet. It can mean organized information. A genealogy is data. A calendar is data. A map is data. A ritual sequence is data. A fishing season remembered through a chant is data. A route across the ocean preserved in star names and swell patterns is data. Ancient people did not need computers to organize information. They had bodies, songs, carvings, memory, landscape, and repeated practice. On Rapa Nui, Roads and platforms may have been part of that organisation. The platforms also had a visual grammar. The Moai on them were often elevated, giving them authority and visibility. Their backs were toward the sea, their faces toward the interior. Their bodies were aligned in relation to the platform. Some had pukau, the red stone topknots or hats. Some platforms held multiple figures, creating a row of ancestral presences. A row changes meaning. One statue may represent a powerful individual ancestor. A row may represent a lineage, a sequence, a collective force. It creates order. The figures stand together, not casually, but arranged. The geometry of a row teaches continuity. One after another, ancestor after ancestor, memory after memory. On a map, these rows can also be compared with the coastline. Many Ahu follow coastal zones, which makes practical and ceremonial sense. The coast was a boundary, a resource zone, and a place of connection to the sea. But the inward-facing statues create a strong directional pattern. They are not simply coastal ornaments, they are oriented toward land and people. This repeated inward gaze may itself be one of the most important geometries of Rapa Nui. The island is encircled not by defensive walls, but by ancestors looking homeward. That arrangement turns the entire island into a kind of watched space, a human interior held within a ring of stone memory. If navigation knowledge was part of the broader system, this inward gaze becomes more subtle. The statues do not need to point outward because they are not signposts for passing ships. Their role may have been to hold community memory, including memory of voyaging within the settled island. A platform near the sea could mark the relationship between land and ocean without looking at the ocean. It could say, in effect, the sea is behind us, but it is not forgotten. The ancestors came through it. The living depend on it. The horizon is part of who we are, even when our faces turn toward home. There are also inland features that matter. Rapa Nui's volcanic craters, especially Rano Raraku, Rano Kau, and other elevated places, shaped the island's geography and meaning. Craters could hold water, stone, vegetation, and sacred associations. From high points, sightlines extend across the island and out toward the sea. When mapping platforms and roads, these features cannot be ignored. A line that looks mysterious on a flat map may simply follow terrain. A road may avoid a difficult slope. A platform may sit where stone and settlement allowed. Yet some choices may also reflect visibility. Being seen from a distance matters. Seeing from a place matters. Sacred landscapes often work through sight as much as touch. This is why the AI model's ability to overlay topography is important. A simple, two-dimensional map can trick us. It flattens hills, hides slopes, and makes difficult routes look easy. On the ground, the island's volcanic shape matters. Moving a Moai required negotiating terrain. Building an Ahu required access to stone, labour and community. Alignments with the sun depended on horizons, not abstract compass points. Sound depended on wind, slope and surface. If the reanalysis treated Rapa Nui as a living three-dimensional landscape, rather than a flat diagram, its patterns would become more meaningful. If it did not, then the results would need even more caution. The road from the quarry to an Ahu may also have carried time inside it. Not clock time, but process time. A statue was not created in an instant. It moved through stages: chosen stone, carving, separation, transport, raising, eye placement, ritual use, maintenance, perhaps later toppling or transformation. The road held the middle of that life. It was the place between becoming and arrival. In many cultures, such in-between spaces are important. A procession route is not just a way to get from one place to another. It is a controlled journey through meaning. On Rapa Nui, the routes may have reminded people that ancestors did not simply exist. They were made present through collective labour. The strange geometry of the island, then, may not be strange to the people who lived it. It may only be strange to us because we separate functions that once belonged together. We ask whether a road was practical or sacred. It may have been both. We ask whether an ahu was a tomb, a monument, a territorial marker, or a calendar point. It may have been several of these at once. We ask whether a statue was an ancestor or a data node. That question sounds modern and slightly ridiculous if taken too literally, but if a data node means a place where memory, authority, time, and knowledge gathered, then yes, perhaps a statue could be that without ever becoming less sacred. This layered understanding also explains why disruption could make the system unreadable. If a road is no longer walked ceremonially, it becomes just a track. If a platform loses its ritual role, it becomes a ruin. If a statue falls, its orientation becomes harder to understand. If oral knowledge is broken by violence, disease, and colonial pressure, then the meanings tied to place become fragmented. The physical geometry remains, but the cultural geometry weakens. Modern AI can rediscover some spatial patterns, but it cannot automatically restore the human practices that made those patterns alive. That is the difference between a map and a memory. The most haunting part of Rapa Nui's landscape is that so much is still there, yet so much is out of reach. The quarry still holds unfinished figures, roads can still be traced, ahu can still be studied, statues can still be measured, the sun still rises and sets over the same island, though the world around it has changed. But the exact words once spoken at a platform, the full reasons for choosing one location over another, the names recited during ceremonies, the teaching attached to a particular route, these are harder to recover. Archaeology can approach them. Oral tradition can preserve parts of them. AI can suggest patterns, but the whole living system remains partly veiled. Still, veiled is not the same as empty. The more closely we look at roads and platforms, the less the island resembles a place of isolated wonders. It becomes a landscape of decisions. The decision to carve at Reanalyzed, the decision to move stone bodies outward, the decision to place ahu near the coast, the decision to face the statues inward, the decision to build roads that connected source and destination, the decision to crown some figures with red stone, the decision to gather in certain places at certain times. Over generations, those decisions form geometry. Not necessarily the cold geometry of rulers and protractors, but the warm geometry of human life arranged around memory. And if AI noticed anything truly unexpected, perhaps it was not a hidden message in the dramatic sense. Perhaps it was the possibility that Rapa Nui's builders had made an island where meaning could be read at different scales. Close up, a Moai is an ancestor. Step back, the ahu is a community centre. Step back again, the roads connect the quarry to the island. Step back farther, the platforms form a ring of presence. Add the sky, and time enters. Add sound, and ceremony enters. Add rongorongo, and sequence enters. Add oral memory, and the whole landscape begins to speak in ways no single stone could manage alone. Near sunset, this geometry would not have looked like a diagram. It would have looked like life. People walking paths, smoke rising from cooking fires, children moving between houses and gardens, waves striking the coast behind the platforms, elders remembering names, shadows stretching from statues across the ground, the Moai standing on their ahu, not as lonely objects but as fixed points in a moving world. The roads carried feet, the platforms carried ancestors, the island carried memory, and above it all the sky continued its steady motion, turning light into direction, direction into season, and season into the next question waiting in the stones. Above those roads, platforms, and patient stone faces, there was another system moving with perfect quiet. It did not need carving tools, ropes, platforms, or chiefs to command it. It rose every morning, crossed the sky, lowered itself toward the horizon, and returned again with the kind of reliability that makes human plans look rather untidy by comparison. The sun was the island's oldest clock. Long before anyone thought to divide a day into neat hours, Long before calendars became squares on a wall or reminders buzzing in a pocket, people watched light move across the world and learned to read it. On Rapa Nui, surrounded by ocean and limited land, that reading may have mattered in ways we are only beginning to understand. When modern eyes look at the Moai, they usually begin with the faces. That is natural. Faces are what humans notice first. We are built for it. We can find faces in clouds, toast, tree bark, and the front of a car that seems mildly disappointed in us. So of course the Moai draw us in through their expressions, their heavy brows, long noses and firm mouths. But if we stand with them for longer, especially in changing light, the statues stop being only faces. They become shadow makers. They become vertical bodies in a moving sky. They catch sunrise along one edge and sunset along another. Their long forms darken the ground behind or before them, depending on the hour. Their platforms receive light differently through the year. And suddenly the old question shifts. Not only what do the statues represent, but what did they do when the sun moved around them? This is where the idea of a calendar written in stone begins. Not a calendar in the modern sense, with months printed in cheerful boxes and one day circled because someone has a dentist appointment they keep pretending to forget. An ancient calendar could be much quieter. It could be a sunrise appearing behind a hill on the same day each year. It could be a shadow reaching a stone at a certain season. It could be the first appearance of a star before dawn. It could be the arrival of birds, the change in winds, the ripening of crops, or the time when ceremonies had to be performed. On an island, such patterns were not decorative. They were practical. They helped people keep their lives aligned with the natural world. The sun's path changes slowly through the year. To someone who does not watch carefully, every sunrise may seem to happen in more or less the same place. But it does not. Over weeks and months, sunrise shifts along the horizon, moving toward one extreme at one solstice, back toward the middle near the equinox, and toward the other extreme at the opposite solstice. Sunset does the same on the other side of the sky. These changes are predictable, and ancient people everywhere noticed them. Not because they were bored and had nothing better to do than stare at the horizon, although one suspects horizon watching can be a very peaceful hobby, but because the sky was a dependable source of timing. It told people when seasons were turning. It gave order to planting, harvesting, fishing, gathering, ritual and travel. Rapa Nui did not have the broad river valleys or endless agricultural plains of some ancient civilizations. It was a small volcanic island with its own difficult conditions. Crops had to be managed carefully. Soil, wind, water and temperature mattered. Sweet potatoes, taro, yams, bananas and other food plants required knowledge of place and season. Stone mulching and garden systems helped protect plants from wind and preserve moisture. In such a world, timing was not an abstract curiosity. It was tied to survival. A community that knew when to plant, when to prepare, when to gather, and when to hold ceremonies connected to seasonal change had an advantage. The sun, watched from fixed places, could help preserve that knowledge across generations. This is why the AI reanalysis becomes interesting again. If Grok AI, or any pattern-finding system like it, compared the orientations of Ahu platforms and Moai with solar events, it might notice whether certain sites relate to solstice or equinox positions more often than chance would suggest. It might test whether lines from platforms to horizon features match sunrise or sunset at important times of year. It might model how shadows from statues fell across the ground when the sun stood at certain angles. It might compare these results with roads, settlement areas, and ceremonial spaces. A human researcher could do this too, of course, and many kinds of archaeoastronomical study have been done around the world without the slightest need for a machine with a dramatic name. But AI can handle many variables at once, which is useful when a landscape has hundreds of features and centuries of change. Still, we must move carefully. Alignments are seductive. They have a way of making the path seem neatly arranged for our amazement. Draw enough lines from enough stones to enough points on the horizon, and something will eventually point somewhere interesting. This is not because ancient people lacked meaning. It is because geometry is generous, and coincidence is a surprisingly busy worker. A single alignment proves little. A repeated pattern, especially one supported by cultural context, is more valuable. If many important platforms relate to solar positions, and if those positions match known seasonal or ceremonial concerns, then the idea becomes stronger. If only one line works after ignoring 50 that do not, then we may have discovered less about the ancient island and more about our own enthusiasm. The possible solar role of the Moai does not need to compete with their ancestral role. In fact, the two may have strengthened each other. An ancestor standing on a platform could watch over the living while also marking the rhythm of the year. The shadow of an ancestor could become a seasonal sign. The appearance of sunlight on a face at a certain dawn could signal a ceremony. The platform where the dead and the living met could also be where the sky confirmed that the proper time had arrived. To modern thinking, this may seem like mixing categories, but to many ancient cultures, time, ancestry, land, and sacred order belong together. The movement of the sun was not just astronomy, it was the behaviour of a world filled with meaning. Imagine a community gathering before dawn. The air is cool, the grass dark, the ocean still breathing somewhere behind the platform. People know the date not because a calendar has told them, but because elders have watched the shifting sunrise over many days. Children are told to look carefully. The horizon brightens. The Moai are still dark shapes. Then, at the expected moment, the first light touches the edge of a statue, or falls between two figures, or stretches a shadow toward a stone marker, or strikes the platform in a way that has happened before and will happen again. To someone outside the tradition, it may look like sunrise. To those who know the place, it is confirmation. The year has turned. The ceremony can begin. The ancestors and the sky agree. This kind of moment is not fantasy. Around the world, people have built and used monuments that interact with sunlight. Some frame sunrise at solstice. Some allow a beam of light into a chamber. Some align avenues with celestial events. The details vary, but the principle is common. A fixed structure and a moving sky create a repeatable sign. What makes Rapa Nui special is the way this possibility intersects with the Moai. These are not anonymous stones. They are ancestral figures. If they participated in solar marking, then the calendar was not only written in stone. It was watched by stone ancestors. The shadows may have been just as important as the light. Shadows are easy to overlook because they feel like absence, but they are one of the simplest ways to measure the sun. A vertical object casts a shadow that changes length and direction through the day. Over the year, the same object's shadow at the same hour will shift. Ancient people did not need modern instruments to notice this. A person who returns to the same place again and again can learn how shadows behave. The body itself becomes a measuring tool. A shadow that reaches a certain point, touches a certain stone, or falls along a platform edge can become a sign. The Moai, with their tall forms and fixed positions, could have created such signs naturally. Were the statues deliberately designed as gnomons, like parts of a sundial? That may be too strong, at least without evidence. A gnomon is a shadow-casting marker, and the Moai certainly cast shadows, but not every shadow is a planned instrument. The more careful possibility is that people noticed and used the shadows of already meaningful statues. Over time, if a statue's shadow marked an important seasonal moment, that observation could become part of its meaning. Later statues or platforms might even have been placed with such effects in mind. This is how practical observation can slowly become tradition. You notice, you repeat, you teach, and eventually the place itself seems to know. AI modelling might help test this by reconstructing solar angles and statue positions. It could ask, for example, whether the shadows of certain Moai would have reached platform edges or nearby stones at solstices or equinoxes. It could compare different periods of the year and different times of day. It could factor in the height and orientation of statues, though erosion, damage and restoration complicate everything. Many Moai have fallen, been moved or been restored. Some no longer stand as they originally did. Some features have changed. The landscape itself has changed through erosion, vegetation shifts, and human intervention. Reconstructing ancient shadow behavior is therefore like trying to solve a puzzle after several pieces have been politely eaten by time. Yet even partial reconstructions can be useful. They can show what was possible. They can identify sites where solar interactions are plausible and sites where they are unlikely. They can separate broad speculation from patterns worth studying. If a platform is said to align with a solstice sunrise, the claim can be tested. If a shadow is said to mark a seasonal event, the geometry can be modelled. The mystery does not vanish when tested. Sometimes it becomes more interesting, because the strongest mysteries are the ones that survive careful questions. There is also the matter of the horizon. On a flat diagram, sunrise is just an angle. On an island, sunrise happens through a real horizon made of slopes, cliffs, craters, and distant ocean. A low ocean horizon makes solar observation different from a mountainous one. In some places, the sun may rise cleanly from the sea. In others, it may appear over landforms. Rapa Nui's triangular volcanic shape gives different viewing points different horizons. An ahu on one coast sees the sky differently from an ahu on another. A platform inland sees something different again. If certain platforms were used to observe solar events, their local horizon mattered. The sun did not rise on a mathematical line. It rose through the island's body. This makes the idea of a calendar written in stone more intimate. It was not just the sun and the statue, it was the sun and the statue, the platform, the horizon, the coast, the season, the community, and the person who knew what to watch for. A calendar like that is not separate from place. Move the observer and the sign changes. Move the statue and the sign changes. Forget the story and the sign becomes ordinary light. The knowledge lived in the relationship. The equinox may have been especially meaningful because it marks a kind of balance when day and night are nearly equal. Solstices mark extremes, the sun's turning points in the year. Many cultures have watched these moments because they are reliable and dramatic in a slow, celestial way. The sun reaches its farthest rising point and then begins to return. A society that pays attention to cycles can turn that motion into ritual language. The year breathes in, the year breathes out, the light moves away, the light comes back. On an island, these cycles might have been woven into agricultural activity, social gatherings and ceremonies of renewal. But the sun was not only a calendar, it was also a source of orientation. In navigation, knowing where the sun rises and sets at different seasons helps build a mental compass. Polynesian navigators used star compasses and detailed environmental knowledge, but the daily path of the sun was part of the wider sky system. If Rapa Nui preserved navigational memory, solar direction may have formed one layer of it. A platform aligned to a sunrise could mark season, but it could also teach direction. A road leading from quarry to coast could be walked, while stories of movement, arrival, and sky paths were recited. A child learning the island might learn land directions and sky directions together. This may be where the AI theory's idea of an ancient data system becomes most compelling. Calendars and navigation are both systems for organising movement. A calendar organises movement through time. Navigation organises movement through space. On Rapa Nui, the two may have overlapped. The same sun that marked planting seasons also marked east and west. The same stars that guided voyagers also appeared in seasonal cycles. The same platforms that held ancestors also stood in fixed relation to horizon points. To a trained culture, the island could become a teaching device for both when and where. This does not mean the Moai were built by a lost advanced civilization in the modern technological sense. They do not need that kind of exaggeration. The real achievement is already extraordinary. A small island society developed monumental art, complex ritual landscapes, agricultural adaptations, and systems of memory in one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. That is impressive enough without adding imaginary machines or secret laboratories. The idea of a stone data system is best understood as a metaphor for organised cultural knowledge, not as a claim that the statues were ancient computers waiting for Grok AI to log in. And yet, the metaphor has power. If information was embedded in where statues stood, how they faced, when shadows fell, which roads connected them, and which ceremonies activated them, then the island did store data. It stored it in a way that required human participation. The Moai were not passive files, they were memory anchors. The sky was not passive background, it was the moving part of the system. The calendar was not printed, it happened. Every dawn, every shadow, every season, the system refreshed itself. Think of the difference between reading a clock and living with a sundial. A clock tells you time no matter where it is, as long as it works. A sundial belongs to its place. It depends on sunlight, latitude, orientation, and the observer's understanding. It is less portable but more connected to the world. Rapa Nui's possible solar system would have been even more place-bound. It would not just tell time. It would tell island time, ancestral time, agricultural time, ceremonial time, and perhaps voyaging time. It would be time woven into stone and land. The human body may also have played a role. People gathered at platforms did not only watch from a distance, they stood, moved, chanted, carried offerings, followed paths, and positioned themselves in relation to the statues and the sun. A shadow that looks like a line on a computer model may have been experienced as shade crossing feet, light touching faces, a crowd turning together, an elder pointing, a chant beginning at the proper moment. Ancient knowledge was often embodied. It was learned through doing, not merely by receiving information. The calendar may have been remembered because people enacted it. There is something gentle and beautiful in that. Modern calendars often feel like obligations, meetings, deadlines, reminders, alerts, and little red numbers that seem to multiply when no one is looking. An ancient seasonal calendar, though certainly tied to work and responsibility, also tied people to recurring natural events. It reminded them that human life sat inside larger cycles. The sun returned, shadows shifted, crops responded, ceremonies came around again, ancestors remained present. Time was not only something spent or lost, it was something recognized. Of course, not every day would have felt sacred. People still had to work, eat, argue, repair, carry, plant, and deal with weather. The past was not a permanent ceremony and flattering sunset light. Someone still had to handle the ancient equivalent of chores, and one imagines nobody enjoyed every single task just because a Moai happened to be nearby looking dignified. But the presence of a sky-linked landscape could turn certain days into moments of shared meaning. It could give rhythm to a society living within sharp environmental limits. It could help coordinate communities and preserve knowledge without relying on written records alone. The loss of such a system would not happen all at once. Meanings fade unevenly. A ceremony stops, but the platform remains. A lineage changes, but the statue remains. A road is no longer walked in the same way, but its trace remains. A solar marker is forgotten, but the sun still rises. Later observers see the pieces and ask what they were for. The island answers only partly. It gives stone, light, and silence. The rest has to be approached with humility. That humility matters especially when AI is involved. A machine may help reconstruct angles of sunlight, but it cannot know whether a particular dawn mattered unless human evidence supports it. It cannot feel the difference between a coincidence and a tradition. It cannot replace Rapa Nui voices or careful archaeology, but it can help reopen questions. It can show that the stones may have interacted with the sky in ways worth examining. It can remind us that the Moai were not static objects in a museum display. They lived in changing light. Their meaning may have shifted with every hour and season. As the sun lowers over Rapa Nui, shadows lengthen from the statues and slide across the platforms. The stone faces, so solid at noon, become softer in evening light. Edges glow, then darken. The ocean behind the Ahu catches the last brightness. The inland fields fall into shade. If a person knew what to watch for, that slow movement might speak. It might say the season is turning. It might say a ceremony is near. It might say a planting time has come, or a story must be retold, or a remembered path across the sea belongs to this part of the year. To us, it is beautiful. To them, it may have been useful, sacred, and familiar. And perhaps that is what makes the idea of a calendar written in stone so quietly powerful. It does not require the Moai to become something other than what they were. It lets them remain ancestors, guardians, and symbols of community. It simply asks whether their stillness worked together with the sky's motion. The statues stood, the sun moved, and between them a pattern appeared for those who had been taught to see. That pattern may have helped hold the year in memory, and with it the rhythms of life on a small island in a very large sea. But light is only one way a monument can speak. A stone body can cast a shadow, yes, and it can hold the warmth of the sun. It can also shape the air around it. It can change how voices carry, how chants gather, how wind moves past a platform, and how a crowd feels when sound returns from stone. The calendar may have been written in sunlight, but another layer of the island's memory may have lived in vibration, in resonance, and in the strange red crowns placed on certain silent heads. The red crowns of Rapa Nui are easy to miss if the mind has already been captured by the faces beneath them. The Moai themselves are so commanding, so still, so instantly recognizable, that the stone forms placed on some of their heads can seem almost like details added later in thought. A visitor might look at a line of statues and notice the brows, the noses, the long ears, the heavy torsos, and only after a moment realise that some were great cylinders of red stone, perched high above their heads as if the island had decided its ancestors were not quite impressive enough without monumental headwear. And really, if there is one thing ancient monuments teach us, it is that human beings have always understood the power of a dramatic silhouette. These red stones are called pukao. They were carved from a different material than most of the Moai, a reddish volcanic scoria rather than the softer grey tuff of Rano Raraku. Their main source was Puna Pau, a small crater quarry on the island. That alone makes them important. A Moai body came mostly from one quarry, while its red crown came from another. 2 stones, 2 origins, 2 journeys, 1 completed figure. The pukao had to be carved, shaped, moved across the landscape, lifted onto statues and balanced in place. Nothing about that process was casual. It took planning, labour, skill, and a reason strong enough to justify moving several tons of red volcanic stone just to crown an already enormous ancestor. The usual interpretation is that the pukao represented hair, perhaps a top knot, a style linked to status, identity, or sacred power. The shape is often described not as a hat in the ordinary sense, but as a representation of hair gathered on the head. The red colour may have mattered deeply. Across many cultures, red carries meanings of life, blood, power, sacredness, rank, danger, or transformation. On Rapa Nui, the red scoria would have stood out against the grey body of the statue and the green, brown and black tones of the island. A crowned Moai would have been visible in a different way, not merely taller, but marked. It said, without words, that this figure had an added layer of importance. But once we begin thinking of the island as a network of memory, the pukao become more than decoration. They become signals. Not signals in the modern traffic light sense, although one can imagine an enormous red stone on a giant head being fairly effective at telling people to stop and pay attention. They may have signalled rank, lineage, ritual power, or the special status of particular ancestors. They may also have changed how statues interacted with light, shadow and sky. A Moai wearing a pukao has a different profile at sunrise and sunset. Its upper outline is broader, heavier, more complex. It catches light differently. It casts a different shadow. It can be recognised from farther away. If certain crowned statues stood at important platforms, Their crowns may have helped mark those figures as key points in the island's ceremonial and memory landscape. This is where the AI reanalysis turns toward distribution. Which statues received pukao? Which did not? Where were crowned figures located? Were they clustered in certain territories? Did they stand on platforms with special social or astronomical importance? Did their positions relate to roads, solar alignments, or old ceremonial paths? A human researcher can ask these questions, and many have studied the physical and cultural role of pukao with great care. But a machine learning approach can compare many features at once. It can look for repeating patterns that might not be obvious if we only admire one crowned statue at a time. It might ask whether pukao were placed randomly across high-status sites, or whether they formed part of a wider visual grammar. Of course, visual grammar is not the same as a hidden code. We have to keep that distinction close, like a lantern in a cave. It is easy to say, this red stone means this exact thing, this position marks this exact date, this alignment points to this exact route. But ancient meaning usually does not sit so neatly in one-to-one translation. A pukao may have meant many things at once. It may have marked a high ancestor, a sacred quality, a lineage claim, a ritual moment, and perhaps a role in a seasonal or spatial system. The question is not whether the pukao were secretly one thing. The question is how many layers of meaning they carried, and whether some of those layers were connected to the island's larger patterns. Their physical presence would have changed the experience of a platform. Imagine standing before a line of moai at dawn. Some heads are bare stone, their profiles severe and smooth. Others carry red crowns rising above the brow line, catching the first light before the face beneath is fully visible. The red stone glows warmer than the body. It may be the first part of the figure to brighten. As the sun climbs, shadows shift from crown to face to torso to ground. At sunset, the opposite happens. The crown may hold the last colour before the statue becomes a dark outline. Such effects do not prove deliberate solar use, but they remind us that a statue was not seen under museum lighting. It lived outdoors, under moving sky. Its appearance changed constantly. The red crowns may also have changed how the statues felt from a distance. A crowned moai was taller, more recognisable, perhaps more authoritative. In a landscape where people moved along roads and approached platforms from specific directions, the silhouette of a pukao could help identify a place before details were visible. It could mark a platform as important within a route. It could serve as a memory cue. The mind remembers distinctive shapes. A road that passes 3 ordinary stones and then reaches the ancestor with the red crown becomes easier to narrate, easier to teach, easier to recall. In oral cultures, visual distinctiveness is not a small thing. It is a tool of memory. Then there is sound, the more elusive companion of stone. If light leaves traces in shadows and alignments, sound is far harder to hold. It passes through air and vanishes. It does not fossilize politely for archaeologists. It does not wait in the ground like a broken tool or a shard of pottery. Yet sound is central to human ritual. A ceremony without sound is difficult to imagine. People chant, sing, speak names, call responses, stamp feet, strike objects, whisper prayers, and listen. Sound binds groups together because it fills shared space. When many voices speak or sing the same words, memory becomes communal. The body learns through rhythm. The mind follows repetition. The place itself seems to answer. On Rapa Nui, the platforms, statues, coastlines, cliffs, open spaces and stone surfaces would all have shaped sound in different ways. A chant near an ahu might carry inland toward a settlement. Waves behind the platform might create a steady background rhythm. Wind might bend or scatter voices. Stone faces and platform walls might reflect sound subtly. In some places, a speaker's voice may have travelled farther or returned as a faint echo. In others, sound may have been swallowed by open air. Ancient people did not need modern acoustic equipment to notice such effects. If a place made voices stronger, stranger, clearer, or more moving, people would know. The idea of resonance can sound very modern, almost as if the island were being described like an instrument built by engineers. We should be cautious with that. The Moai were not tuning forks in the simple sense, and the Ahu were not concert halls with reserved seating and someone coughing in the back row. But sacred spaces often work acoustically whether or not their builders use technical language. A cave changes the voice. A stone chamber deepens a chant. A cliff face returns an echo. A courtyard gathers sound. A platform near the sea mixes human voice with wave rhythm. These effects can become part of ritual because people experience them directly. If the AI reanalysis suggested that certain platforms or statue arrangements had unusual acoustic qualities, it would be asking whether sound formed another layer of the island's memory system. Perhaps some sites were chosen not only for visibility, ancestry or territory, but also because voices carried well there. Perhaps ceremonial chants were performed in places where sound spread across a community. Perhaps the shape of an Ahu, the line of statues, and the open ground before them created a space where group singing became especially powerful. If memory was preserved through recitation, then acoustics mattered. A place that helps people hear and repeat words helps knowledge survive. Think of how easily a song stays in memory compared with a plain sentence. You may forget a shopping list in 3 minutes, especially if one of the items was the thing you actually went to the shop for, but a childhood song can remain for decades. Rhythm holds words, melody holds sequence, repetition holds structure. In oral traditions, this is not a charming accident. It is a serious technology of memory. Knowledge can be sung because song protects it from being lost. Navigation knowledge, genealogies, ceremonial sequences, seasonal markers, laws and histories can all be carried through sound. If Rapa Nui's landscape supported certain kinds of chanting or recitation, then sound may have been as important as stone. The Moai themselves may have acted as more than listeners in this setting. Their presence would have changed the meaning of speech. Speaking before an ancestor is not the same as speaking in an empty field. A chant performed facing a line of Moai would feel directed, witnessed, anchored. The sound may have moved through air, but socially and spiritually it moved through ancestry. The living voiced memory before the dead, and the dead, in stone form, gave that memory authority. That is a powerful arrangement. It turned sound into a bridge between generations. Could the pukao have affected sound? This is more speculative. Their shape and position might have slightly changed how sound moved around a statue, especially close to the figure, but we should not imagine them as carefully tuned acoustic devices without strong evidence. Their more likely acoustic role may have been indirect. By marking certain statues as special, they identified places where particular ceremonies, chants, or gatherings occurred. A red-crowned ancestor could become the visual anchor for a sound event. The crown says, "This is the one." The voice follows, the people remember. There is also the possibility that the red stone itself had symbolic associations with voice, power, or activation. We cannot claim that too strongly, but many cultures connect colour, material, and ritual action. A different stone from a different quarry adds a second origin to the statue. The Moai body comes from Rano Raraku. The pukao comes from Punapau. When joined, they combine sources. That combination may have mattered. It may have linked different parts of the island within one figure. In a memory network, material origin can be information. The statue does not simply stand in one place. It carries the island's geography in its body. The journey of the pukao from Punapau must have been impressive in its own right. These were not small ornaments, some were massive cylinders, shaped and moved across uneven ground. Their transport required roads or pathways, coordination, and lifting techniques. Once at the Ahu, they had to be raised onto statues, possibly using ramps, levers, ropes, and careful engineering. The very act of placing a pukao would have been a public demonstration of skill and authority. It may have been ceremonial. It may have drawn people together. It may have added a final visible sign that an ancestor had reached a completed state. If we think of the Moai as a kind of sequence, then the pukao could mark completion or elevation. Carving gives body, transport gives movement, raising gives presence, eyes give sight, pukao gives distinction. Each step adds meaning. Each step may have involved sound, commands, chants, prayers, songs, or the creaking strain of the ropes. The statue's life was not silent until later. It was made through noise, effort, and repeated human voices. The silence we hear now is the silence after all those voices have faded. That silence is deceptive. Rapa Nui today can feel quiet in photographs, but an inhabited ceremonial landscape would have been full of sound. Wind over grass, surf against rock, birds, children, work songs, stone tools striking volcanic tuff, people calling across fields, fires crackling, ceremonial voices rising near platforms. The quarry at Reanalyzed itself must once have had a particular soundscape. Carving, scraping, instruction, footsteps on stone, workers speaking, perhaps ritual speech around figures emerging from the rock. When the AI theory speaks of resonance, it may be inviting us to remember that monuments were not only seen, they were heard. Sound also travels differently at different times of day. Cool air, wind direction, humidity, and terrain all affect how far voices carry. Dawn ceremonies may have sounded different from midday gatherings. Night rituals under stars may have felt different again. On a remote island with little artificial noise, the human voice could have carried with an intimacy that modern city dwellers rarely experience. A chant at the right place, with the sea behind and stone before, might have filled the air in a way that people remembered for life. Memory loves emotion, and sound is very good at creating emotion. This may connect to the idea that the island was a navigational archive. Polynesian navigation relied heavily on oral teaching. Star names, wind directions, wave patterns, island sequences, and ocean signs could be preserved in chants and structured language. If Rapa Nui held memory of the long-distance voyaging, that memory may not have been carved entirely in visible symbols. It may have been performed. A platform might serve as the location where certain chants were recited. A road might structure the order in which knowledge was taught. A crowned statue might mark the ancestor associated with a particular route or tradition. The archive would exist only when people activated it through voice. This is why the word silent, when applied to the Moai, is both true and untrue. They are silent now in the obvious way. They do not speak. They do not explain themselves. They remain still while people ask questions around them. But their silence may be the remains of a sound system that once depended on human performance. The stones did not need to speak because people spoke with them, before them, through them, and in relation to them. The statues were not the whole message. They were the anchors around which messages could be remembered. A machine can model sound in simplified ways. It can estimate how surfaces reflect, how open spaces carry, how terrain affects travel of sound. It can compare possible acoustic zones around platforms. But sound is among the hardest ancient experiences to recover. The original statues may have stood differently. Some have fallen or been restored. The landscape's vegetation has changed. Structures that once stood nearby may be gone. The number of people gathered at a ceremony would alter acoustics. Wind direction could change everything. A computer model can suggest possibilities, but it cannot recreate a full night of chanting under a sky bright with stars. Some parts of the past remain stubbornly human. And that may be a good thing. Not every mystery should become a clean diagram. The value of acoustic thinking is not that it proves the island was an engineered sound machine. It is that it reminds us to imagine ancient life with all senses awake. Archaeology often begins with what survives: stone, bone, charcoal, tools, foundations. But people lived through smell, sound, warmth, weather, fear, humour, fatigue, and attention. A Moai platform was not only a structure, it was a place where bodies stood, voices rose, feet shifted, children fidgeted, elders listened, and the sea continued its endless low speech behind the ceremony. The pukao in this sensory world would have been vivid, their colour in sunlight, their mass above the statue, their source from a separate quarry, their visibility from a distance, their possible role in marking special ancestors, their connection to effort, ceremony and status. They were not accessories, they were part of the completed presence of certain Moai. If the island contained a memory system, the pukao may have been one of the ways that system created emphasis. Like a red mark in a manuscript, a louder note in a chant, or a raised voice at the turning point of a story, they told the eye that something mattered here. The idea of resonance also has a metaphorical layer, though we should keep it grounded. A culture resonates when different parts reinforce one another. Stone, road, sky, sound, and story can all strengthen the same memory. A ceremony at a platform might align with a season, honour an ancestor, gather a community, recite a genealogy, teach a root, and mark a political relationship all at once. Each layer supports the others. The knowledge becomes harder to forget because it is not stored in only one form. It is seen, heard, walked, repeated, and felt. That is a strong archive. Stronger perhaps than a single written record left alone in a damp corner where some future mouse makes bold editorial choices. If later disruptions broke that system, the silence would be profound. The crowned statues remain, but the reason one was crowned and another was not may become uncertain. The platforms remain, but the chants once spoken there may fade. The roads remain, but the ceremonial journeys may stop. The glyphs remain, but the reading tradition may be lost. Outsiders arrive and see objects. They do not hear the instructions that once moved through them. This is how a living system becomes a mystery. Yet some resonance continues. The Moai still affect people. The red pukao still draw the eye. The platforms still gather attention. The wind and waves still create the island's soundscape. Living Rapa Nui culture continues to hold identity, memory and connection to place despite the historical wounds that tried to break them. The stones are not merely relics of a vanished people. They are part of an ongoing relationship between past and present. Any theory about hidden systems must remember this. The island is not silent because it has no living voice. It is silent only to those who do not know how to listen properly. As evening settles again across Rapa Nui, imagine a crowned Moai at the edge of a platform. The red stone above its head catches a last warmth from the sinking sun. The face beneath has already fallen into shadow. Behind the ahu, the ocean rolls and breaks as steady as breathing. A voice begins somewhere near the platform, then another joins, then another, until the space is filled with sound. The chant may name ancestors. It may recall land. It may hold a sequence of seasons, a voyage, a warning, a blessing, or a story that children will hear many times before they understand it. The statue does not speak, but it makes the speaking matter. The crown does not sing, but it marks the presence before which the song is carried. This is the island's silent resonance. Not silence as emptiness, but silence as the afterimage of sound. The stones hold no recordings we can play back. There is no hidden button beneath a pukao that releases an ancient chant, though one imagines tourism would become very complicated if there were. What remains is the arrangement, the material, the effort, the visual emphasis, the possibility that certain places shaped human voices and helped memory travel through generations. The AI can point toward patterns. The stones can show where people gathered. The wind can remind us that sound once moved here. But the full meaning lives somewhere between what survives and what has been lost. And that brings us to the most stubbornly quiet evidence of all, the carved signs of Rongorongo. If the roads were walked memory, if the Moai were ancestral memory, if the sun gave seasonal memory, and if chants carried spoken memory, then Rongorongo may represent something even more tantalizing. a sequence of marks, cut into wood, still visible, still ordered, still refusing to be read with certainty. It is the place where Rapa Nui's memory seems almost ready to speak in written form, and yet remains just beyond reach, like a voice heard through a closed door. If the Moai are the island's stone memory, and the roads are its walked memory, then Rongorongo feels like the moment when Rapa Nui comes closest to speaking in a voice we can almost hear. Almost is the important word. The signs are there. They are carved, ordered, repeated, arranged in lines, and clearly made by people who knew what they were doing. They are not random scratches. They are not idle decoration made by someone passing a slow afternoon with a sharp tool and a plank of wood. They look intentional. They look patterned. They look like they are carrying something, and yet after more than a century of effort nobody can read them with certainty. That is what makes Rongorongo so quietly haunting. It is not silence in the ordinary sense. It is a locked voice, a row of marks preserved from a world that suffered terrible disruption before outsiders understood enough to ask the right people the right questions in the right way. The tablets and objects that survive show figures that resemble humans, birds, plants, fish, tools, celestial forms and shapes that resist easy naming. The signs curve and repeat. They seem to follow a special reading order, with some lines turned upside down relative to others, as if the reader rotated the object back and forth while moving through the text. It is a system that looks organised enough to invite confidence and mysterious enough to punish it. Many people have tried to solve Rongorongo. Scholars, linguists, enthusiasts, dreamers, and the occasional person who may have spent slightly too much time alone with a notebook and a very strong cup of coffee have all looked at the signs and wondered whether a key might be found. Some have proposed that it records genealogies. Others suggest chants, calendars, religious texts, land rights, lists of names, astronomical observations, or mnemonic cues for oral recitation. Some think it may not be full writing in the way alphabetic scripts are, but a system of symbols that helped trained readers remember longer oral compositions. Others argue that it could be a true script, though undeciphered because the surviving examples are too few and the language context too damaged. The difficulty is that a script is not solved by imagination alone. To decipher an unknown writing system, researchers usually need repeated patterns, known language, bilingual texts, or enough examples to test hypotheses. The Rosetta Stone helped unlock Egyptian hieroglyphs because it carried the same decree in different scripts and languages. Rongorongo has no such convenient gift waiting beside it saying, "Here you are, future scholars. Please enjoy this tidy translation. The surviving corpus is limited." Many tablets were lost, destroyed, removed, or damaged. The cultural chain of reading was broken. By the time outsiders began to seriously record the system, the people who could explain it fully, if any still lived, were no longer available in the way they needed to be. History had already done its damage. That damage is essential to remember. Rongorongo did not become unread simply because time passed politely over the island. Rapa Nui's 19th century history included disease, slave raids, forced removals, missionary pressure, population collapse, and colonial exploitation. Knowledge systems do not survive such violence easily. A reading tradition can disappear in a single generation if teachers are killed, displaced, silenced, or forced to abandon old practices. A tablet may survive in a museum drawer, but the voice that animated it may be gone. That is one of the deep tragedies of Rongorongo. The signs are visible, but the human continuity needed to read them was wounded before the world understood what it was losing. This is why the idea of Rongorongo as a lost archive of memory feels so powerful. It may not have been an archive in the modern sense. There may not have been shelves of tablets catalogued by subject, with one section for gardening, another for navigation, and a stern ancient librarian reminding everyone not to return the sacred wood late. But the surviving inscriptions suggest that Rapa Nui had ways of arranging signs in sequence, and sequence is the heart of memory. A sequence can preserve a chant. It can order names. It can mark nights of the moon. It can track ritual steps. It can help a trained person recite something too long to hold casually in the mind. It can store information not by spelling out every word, but by guiding the person who already knows the tradition. This distinction matters because modern readers often expect writing to be self-contained. We want the marks to speak directly to us. We expect a symbol to equal a sound, a word, or a phrase, and then we expect the whole thing to unfold like a translated book. But not all recording systems work that way. Some are mnemonic. They cue memory rather than replace it. A string of signs may not contain the whole speech, but it may tell a trained reader which speech to perform and in what order. Think of musical notation. The marks on the page are not the music itself. They're instructions for someone who knows how to bring the music back into the air. To a person who cannot read notation, the page is silent. To a musician, it is sound waiting. Rongorongo may have worked partly like that. We cannot say for certain, but the possibility fits the broader world of Rapa Nui memory. If roads guided movement, if platforms anchored ancestry, if Moai carried lineage and authority, if seasonal light marked time, and if chants helped knowledge survive, then carved symbols may have acted as another layer in the same system. They may have preserved order. They may have helped specialists recall sacred recitations, genealogies, calendars, or histories. The signs may have been less like a modern book and more like a doorway into trained knowledge. Without the training, the doorway remains closed. This is where Grok AI, in the story of Reanalyzed, becomes both intriguing and limited. An AI system can compare Rongorongo glyphs with maps, statue patterns, astronomical cycles, and other forms of data. It can identify repeated signs. It can cluster similar shapes. It can test whether certain sequences appear often. It can compare the number of signs in a line with possible lunar or calendar counts. It can ask whether bird-like figures appear in context that might relate to seasons, migration, or ritual. It can examine whether certain glyph groups resemble patterns in platform distribution or ceremonial cycles. In short, it can look for structure. But structure is not meaning. This is the caution that must follow us like a patient dog. A machine can find repeated signs without knowing what they mean. It can connect a bird glyph to a bird season because the idea feels plausible, but plausibility is not proof. It can find a pattern of numbers and suggest a calendar, but many sequences can be made to resemble time cycles, if one is flexible enough with counting. It can compare shapes and propose categories, but it cannot know whether a sign represents a bird, a deity, a clan, a sound, a verb, a star, a memory cue, or something that does not fit neatly into any modern category. AI can help organize the mystery. It cannot simply dissolve it. Still, organization has value. Rongorongo is difficult partly because the signs are numerous, varied, and not fully standardized in the way familiar scripts are. Some glyphs appear in different forms. Some may be ligatures, combining signs. Some may have rotated or stylized versions. Some may be damaged. A careful computational approach can help build better sign inventories, compare inscriptions, detect repeated sequences, and test whether the system behaves more like writing, notation, genealogy, or ritual mnemonic. It can help separate wishful readings from patterns that genuinely recur. It can tell us with quiet usefulness not what the signs say, but how they behave. How something behaves can be a clue. If signs repeat in predictable positions, that may suggest formulaic language or ritual structure. If certain sequences appear at the beginning or end of texts, they might be titles, invocations, names, or opening and closing formulas. If signs cluster in counts that match lunar cycles, perhaps calendars are involved. If human figures appear near certain other forms, maybe genealogies or ceremonial roles are being recorded. If the same sequence appears across multiple tablets, it may have been an important chant or standardized tradition. None of these clues is enough alone, but together they narrow the field. The fog does not vanish, but it becomes less shapeless. The possible connection between Rongorongo and calendars has always been tempting. Rapa Nui life, like all island life, depended on timing. The moon, the sun, seasons, fishing, planting, bird activity and ritual cycles all mattered. Some Polynesian cultures used lunar calendars with named nights and activities tied to phases of the moon. If Rongorongo recorded calendar information, it might not be surprising. A wooden tablet could preserve a cycle of nights, ceremonies, or seasonal duties. But even here, caution is needed. A sequence of signs that can be counted into calendar-like groups does not automatically become a calendar. Human beings are very good at arranging evidence into the shape they hope to find. It is one of our gifts and one of our little disasters. The link to navigation is even more alluring. If Rapa Nui preserved memory of star paths and ocean routes, could Rongorongo have recorded voyaging knowledge? Perhaps. Polynesian navigation is rich in structured knowledge. Stars rising and setting, winds, swells, birds, clouds, islands, and remembered paths across the sea. Such information can be encoded in chants, diagrams, teaching tools, or symbolic sequences. A Rongorongo tablet might have served as a mnemonic aid for navigational recitation. A line of glyphs might cue a sequence of stars or islands. A bird sign might mark landfall. A fish sign might mark a region of sea. A human figure might mark an ancestor voyager. It is a beautiful thought. But beautiful thoughts must not be allowed to run around unattended. There is no accepted reading that proves Rongorongo records ocean routes. The AI reanalysis might suggest correspondences between glyph sequences and possible navigational structures, but those correspondences would need careful testing. Do they repeat across tablets? Do they match known Polynesian star systems? Do they fit the Rapa Nui language? Are they supported by oral traditions? Or are they modern projections? The kind of thing that happens when we see a bird and immediately ask which island it must secretly point toward? The answer is not yet secure. Even so, the broader idea remains meaningful. Whether Rongorongo recorded calendars, genealogies, chants, or navigation, it shows that memory on Rapa Nui was structured with care. The people who made the glyphs were not simply living day to day without concern for preserving knowledge. They carved sequences into wood, a material far less durable than stone but portable, intimate and tied to the hand. A tablet could be held. It could be turned. It could be read or recited from. It could travel between people or places. Compared with a moai, it was small. But small things can carry enormous memory. A seed is small. A word is small. A password is small enough to forget at the worst possible moment and powerful enough to lock you out of your entire digital life. Scale is not the same as importance. The reading order of Rongorongo adds another layer of fascination. Many inscriptions appear to use a system known as reverse bustrophodon, where lines alternate direction, and the tablet is turned as the reader moves from one line to the next. This creates a physical rhythm. Reading is not only eye movement, it is hand movement. The object must be rotated. The body participates. That may seem like a small detail, but in memory systems, physical action matters. Turning the tablet could reinforce sequence. It could make reading a performance. It could link the carved signs to gesture, voice, and attention. The reader does not simply look. The reader handles the archive. If Rongorongo was used in ritual contexts, this turning motion may have been meaningful. Imagine a specialist holding a tablet before a gathering. The signs guide recitation. The tablet turns, lines unfold, a chant moves forward. The audience hears names, seasons, gods, ancestors, or remembered events. The wooden object is not merely text, it is an instrument of performance. Like the moai, it comes alive through use. Without the voice, it becomes quiet. Without the trained reader, it becomes a beautiful object full of unanswered questions. The material itself matters too. Rongorongo was carved on wood, and wood was precious on an island that experienced major deforestation. Many surviving tablets may have been made from driftwood or later materials, and the history of their production is complex. The very choice to carve signs into wood suggests value. Wood could decay, burn, break, or be taken. It required care. Stone monuments fixed memory in place. Wooden tablets made memory portable. A culture with both had two different ways to hold knowledge, one anchored to landscape, the other held in the hand. That contrast is important. The island archive may have included both immovable and movable memory. This is where the AI theory tries to connect Rongorongo to the broader landscape. What if certain glyphs were not meant to be understood alone, but in relation to places? What if a tablet sequence matched a ceremonial route, guiding the reader through sites around the island? What if signs cued not only words but locations? Quarry, platform, coast, crater, star point, seasonal event. In such a system, a wooden tablet might function like a portable key to a landscape memory palace. The signs are the prompts, the island is the book, the reader is the bridge between them. Again, this is speculative, but it fits the kind of layered memory we have been tracing. Ancient knowledge often works by linking media. A chant points to a place points to an ancestor points to a story points to a season points to a ceremony. A carved sign may point to the chant that starts the whole chain moving. If one link breaks, the others become harder to follow. If many links break, the system becomes almost invisible to outsiders. They see a platform, a statue, a road, a glyph, and treat them separately, while the original system may have lived in the connections. The tragedy of Rongorongo is that the connections were damaged before they could be fully recorded. The surviving tablets mostly reside outside the island, scattered in museums and collections. Their removal reflects a wider history in which Rapa Nui objects, bodies, labour, and knowledge were taken, studied, displayed, and interpreted by outsiders. Any conversation about decipherment should be aware of this. Rongorongo is not just a puzzle, it is cultural heritage. It belongs to a people whose history includes profound loss and resilience. A solution, if one ever comes, should not be treated as a trophy for clever outsiders, but as part of a respectful relationship with living Rapa Nui identity. That does not mean curiosity is wrong. It means curiosity must be humble. There is a difference between listening at a closed door and trying to kick it open because mystery is inconvenient. Rongorongo asks for patience. It asks us to admit that some things may remain unread for a long time. It asks us to build evidence slowly, sign by sign, pattern by pattern, while remembering that behind every glyph was a human world, not a puzzle designed for us. One of the most interesting possibilities is that Rongorongo preserved genealogies. Ancestor lists were important in Polynesian societies, linking people to rank, land, authority, and sacred origins. A sequence of signs could help preserve names and relationships. If the Moai represented ancestors in stone, and Rongorongo preserved ancestral sequences in signs, then the two systems may have supported each other. A platform shows the presence of ancestry in place. A tablet preserves the order of ancestry in memory. A ceremony brings both together through voice. That is a strong archive. Stone, sign, and speech reinforcing lineage. Another possibility is that Rongorongo recorded ritual chants. Ritual language often uses repeated formulas, sacred names, mythological sequences, and references to natural cycles. Such texts would be difficult to translate even if we could identify the language, because ritual meaning depends on context. A word may refer to a god, a place, an action, a metaphor, and a seasonal sign all at once. This is one reason decipherment is hard. The signs may not correspond neatly to everyday speech. They may belong to a specialized tradition. If so, AI may detect repetition, but human cultural understanding would be needed to interpret why the repetition matters. The Birdman cult, centered in later Rapa Nui history, around ceremonies connected to the Elet of Motu Nui and the competition to obtain the first sooty tern egg, also enters the wider conversation. Bird imagery appears in Rapa Nui art and symbols, and some Rongorongo signs resemble bird forms. Could parts of the script connect to bird seasons, ritual status, or the later religious system that rose as Moai construction declined? Possibly. The island's memory changed over time. The Moai era and later Birdman practices were not simply separate worlds, but parts of a changing society. Rongorongo may belong to one or more phases of that history. The signs might preserve traditions older than the surviving tablets, or reflect newer systems that emerged after social and religious shifts. Dating and context remain difficult. This reminds us that Rapa Nui was not frozen in one perfect ancient moment. It changed. People adapted, beliefs shifted, monuments were built, used, altered, toppled, restored, remembered differently. A memory system is not static. It can be rewritten, emphasized, reinterpreted, or abandoned. The lost archive of Rongorongo may not preserve one single unified code. It may preserve fragments of a living tradition that changed across generations. That makes it harder to read, but also more human. The AI reanalysis, at its best, does not claim to end the mystery. It suggests that Rongorongo might be approached not only as an isolated script problem, but as part of the island's whole information landscape. Instead of asking only what does this glyph sound like, we might also ask, where might this sequence have been performed? What ceremony might have needed it? Which seasonal cycle might it track? Which ancestor line might it support? Which route, platform, or sky event might have given it context? This does not replace linguistic analysis. It expands the field of questions, and perhaps that is the real value of thinking about Rongorongo beside the Moai. The statues teach us that memory can be monumental. The roads teach us that memory can be walked. The sun and shadows teach us that memory can be timed. Sound teaches us that memory can be performed. Rongorongo teaches us that memory can be sequenced. Each form has limits. Stone cannot move easily. Roads can be forgotten. Sun signs require observers. Chants require singers. Wooden tablets can burn, break, or be taken. But together, they make a resilient system, at least until history breaks too many strands at once. Imagine again a quiet night on the island. A tablet is held in firelight. The signs catch small shadows in their carved grooves. A reader turns the wood at the end of a line. Nearby, perhaps, elders listen. Beyond the shelter, the Moai stand in darkness. The road to the platform is known by foot. The stars overhead are known by name. The sea wind moves through the grass. The signs on the wood do not need to explain everything by themselves. They are part of a world where knowledge lives in many places at once. To someone trained within that world, the tablet may open like a path. To us, it remains closed, but not empty. That closeness is part of its power. Rongorongo refuses the modern demand for instant access. It reminds us that not every ancient message is available simply because we want it. It asks us to sit with uncertainty. That can be uncomfortable, especially in an age when a phone can answer simple questions faster than a person can find their glasses. But uncertainty is not failure. Sometimes it is the most honest way to stand before the past. The signs are there. The meaning is damaged, not erased. The task is not to force them into speech, but to listen carefully enough that, if a pattern truly emerges, we can recognize it without pretending we heard more than we did. As the idea of Rapa Nui as an ancient memory system comes into focus, Rongorongo becomes the most delicate evidence. It is tempting because it looks like the written key. It is dangerous because it can be made to say almost anything by those too eager to solve it. It is precious because it may preserve the island's own ways of ordering knowledge. Whether it records genealogy, ritual, calendar, navigation, or a mixture of these, it stands as proof that memory on Rapa Nui was not simple. It had signs, it had sequences, it had specialists. It had a form that outsiders still cannot master, and beyond the tablets, beyond the platforms, Beyond the crowned statues and the roads, there remains one final layer of the mystery, the ocean itself. Rapa Nui did not exist in isolation because its people lacked connection. It existed at the far reach of a voyaging world that once knew how to cross astonishing distances. The same culture that carved memory into stone and wood came from people who read stars, swells, winds, and birds with extraordinary skill. If the island was preserving anything, perhaps it was not only the memory of ancestors who lived there, but the memory of routes that reached far beyond the horizon, back into the great Pacific network from which Rapa Nui was born. By the time we have followed the roads, stood before the platforms, watched the shadows move, listened for the vanished sound of chants, and paused over the unread signs of Rongorongo, the mystery of Rapa Nui begins to feel less like a single locked door and more like a house with many rooms. The Moai are one room, the roads are another. The Ahu platforms, the red pukao, the quarry, the sun, the stars, the ocean, the carved wooden tablets, the ceremonies, the ancestors, the memories carried in speech, all of these belong to the same house. And the question is no longer simply why did people carve giant statues on one of the most remote islands on Earth? The question becomes what kind of knowledge needed such strong anchors. At first, the answer seems obvious. The island was preserving ancestors. That is the oldest and most grounded explanation. The Moai were not random stoneheads, not lonely decorations, not puzzles built for strangers in the future. They represented powerful ancestral figures connected to lineage, authority, land, and sacred presence. They stood on Ahu platforms and faced inland toward the communities descended from them. They watched the living. They held memory in a form that could not easily be ignored. A person could forget a name spoken once, but it is much harder to forget an ancestor raised in stone above the coast, looking toward your fields, your houses, your paths, and your daily life with the calm seriousness of someone who expects you to remember where you came from. But perhaps ancestry was only the beginning of what the island preserved. Not a small beginning, of course. Ancestry can contain nearly everything in a traditional society. It can hold land rights, social rank, sacred obligations, marriage relationships, histories of migration, stories of gods and founders, and the proper order of ceremonies. To remember an ancestor was not only to honour the dead, it was to remember how society was arranged. It was to remember who belonged where, who had responsibilities, and which stories gave meaning to the land. The Moai may have been stone bodies, but they were also social memory made visible. Now imagine that this memory had to survive on a small island surrounded by the largest ocean on Earth. Rapa Nui was not a place where people could afford careless forgetting. Its isolation made memory practical. A community needed to know where fresh water could be found, how soils behaved, where gardens could survive the wind, where fish could be caught, which seasons brought certain resources, which caves or stones mattered, which families held which territories, and how to manage life within firm limits. On a remote island, knowledge is not an ornament, it is a safety net. Forget enough, and the world becomes dangerous. This is why the idea of an island-wide memory system feels so compelling. The Moai may have preserved ancestors, but the ancestors themselves may have preserved knowledge. A statue was not only a face, it was a cue. It stood in a place connected to a lineage. That lineage connected to land. That land connected to resources, ceremonies, obligations, and histories. A platform might mark the presence of the dead, but also the boundaries of the living. A road might move a statue, but also teach a route. A seasonal shadow might mark the sun's return, but also remind a community when to prepare, gather, plant, or perform ritual. Rongorongo signs might preserve sequences that a trained reader could recite. All of it together could form a system of memory spread across the island. If Grok AI's reanalysis points toward anything useful, it is not that the island was hiding a simple secret message. Ancient places rarely work like treasure maps. There is usually no single symbol that, when understood, suddenly explains everything while dramatic music rises in the background and someone drops a clipboard. The more interesting possibility is that Rapa Nui's knowledge was distributed. It lived in many forms at once. Stone held some of it, wood held some of it, voice held some of it, movement held some of it, the sky held some of it. The ocean held some of it. People carried the rest in memory, training, and repeated practice. This would not be unusual in the wider human story. Before writing became common in many parts of the world, people developed powerful ways to remember. They used songs, stories, genealogies, carved marks, monuments, ritual paths, star lore, seasonal festivals, and sacred landscapes. Even in literate societies, we still do this. A national monument preserves history through place. A church bell marks time and gathers people. A family photograph holds a name, a date, a face, and a feeling. A song can carry a whole period of life back into the mind with one familiar line. Humans do not store memory in only one place. We scatter it across the world and then build habits that help us gather it again. Rapa Nui may have done this with unusual intensity because its situation demanded it. The island's people came from Polynesian voyagers, heirs to one of the most remarkable navigation traditions ever known. Their ancestors crossed the Pacific by reading stars, waves, winds, birds, clouds, and currents. That kind of knowledge is not simple. It is not a list of instructions that can be handed to someone 10 minutes before departure with a cheerful good luck. It requires training, repetition, observation, and trust. It turns the world itself into a guide. A navigator learns not only where to go, but how to notice. The ocean becomes information. The sky becomes structure. The body becomes an instrument. So what might Rapa Nui have been trying to preserve? Perhaps it was trying to preserve the memory of orientation. Not only the ability to travel back across the ocean, though that may have mattered in stories and identity, but the deeper habit of knowing where one stands in relation to everything else. The Moai oriented communities toward their ancestors. The Ahu oriented lineages toward land. The roads oriented movement from quarry to platform. The sun oriented the year. The stars oriented the sea. Rongorongo may have oriented memory and sequence. The whole island may have been a teaching landscape, reminding people how to locate themselves in time, space, society, and ancestry. That sounds grand, but in daily life it would have been very practical. A child grows up learning that this platform belongs to these ancestors. This road leads toward the quarry. This crowned statue marks a special lineage. This season is known by the sun's position. This chant names a route. This sign sequence belongs to a ceremony. This coast has a story. This field has an obligation. The knowledge is not taught all at once because no child has ever been improved by being handed an entire civilization before breakfast. It comes slowly, through walking, watching, listening, working, and being corrected by elders, sometimes gently, and sometimes perhaps with the ancient equivalent of a long sigh. The idea of a hidden data system can therefore be understood in a calmer way. It does not have to mean that the Moai were machines. It does not have to mean that every platform was a precise observatory, or every glyph a secret star chart. It means the island may have stored organized knowledge in physical relationships. In modern language, we call that data. In older language, we might call it memory, tradition, sacred order, or the proper way of knowing the world. The danger is making the past sound more advanced only when it resembles modern technology. The truth is that ancient people did not need to imitate computers to be intelligent. They had their own technologies of memory, many of which were beautifully suited to the worlds they inhabited. One thing Easter Island may have been trying to preserve was time, not time as seconds and minutes, but the year as lived experience, the sun's movement across the horizon, the changing length of shadows, the arrival of seasons, the proper timing of ceremonies, the rhythm of planting and harvest, the return of birds, the conditions of wind and sea, A small island society needed a reliable way to keep its activities aligned with natural cycles. If certain Erhu or Moai helped mark solar events, then the calendar was not separate from sacred life. It was built into the presence of ancestors. Time was watched by the dead and enacted by the living. Another thing it may have preserved was territory. The platforms around the island were not only ceremonial centres, they were connected to groups, lands and rites. Ahu and Moai could make claims visible. They could say, "This place has a history. This land is held within memory. These ancestors stand behind these people." In a limited island landscape, such claims mattered. Territory is not only about control, it is about responsibility. A family or group connected to land had obligations to maintain, use, protect, and remember it. The statues helped make those relationships durable. It may also have preserved social order. A society capable of carving and moving Moai required organisation. Leaders, specialists, carvers, farmers, workers, ritual authorities, and communities all played roles. The statues expressed power, but power on Rapa Nui was likely tied to sacred ancestry and the ability to mobilise labour. The larger and more elaborate the monument, the more it displayed not only devotion, but social capacity. A crowned Moai with a red pukao said that a group had the authority, resources and knowledge to complete a difficult task. It was a public statement, made in stone, about who they were. The island may have been preserving roots as well. Roads from Rano Raraku to the Ahu were practical, but they also connected the island's central source of statue stone to many communities. Every Moai carried the quarry with it. Every route out from the quarry repeated a relationship between shared origin and local identity. If some roads became ceremonial paths, they may have preserved stories of movement. They may have echoed older voyaging memories, not by pointing simply to distant islands, but by teaching people that identity is carried along paths. The ancestors moved from stone source to sacred platform, just as people once moved across the ocean from homeland to new land. And yes, perhaps the island preserved navigation in a more direct way too. Polynesian cultures held sophisticated knowledge of stars, swells, winds and ocean signs. If parts of that knowledge remained important on Rapa Nui, it could have been embedded in chant, ceremony, platform orientation, or symbolic sequence. The Moai did not need to face the sea to preserve ocean memory. They faced the people, because the people were the carriers of that memory. A statue could anchor a story about arrival. A platform near the coast could mark a relationship with the horizon. Rongorongo signs might have cued recitations of star paths or seasonal sea knowledge. We cannot claim this as proven, but as a possibility it fits the island's heritage of voyaging. Then there is the knowledge of sound. If certain places supported chanting, echo, or the carrying of voices, the island may have preserved memory through performance. Words spoken once disappear. Words spoken rhythmically, in a place charged with meaning before a line of ancestors, can last much longer. A chant is memory with a body. It can be taught, repeated, corrected, and felt. If the Ahu were sound spaces as well as visual spaces, then ceremonies may have helped keep knowledge active. A silent platform today may once have been a place where names, seasons, histories and roots were carried through the air. Rongorongo remains the most tantalizing sign that something more formal was being preserved. The glyphs are ordered. They repeat. They suggest trained use. Whether they record genealogies, chants, calendars, ritual sequences or something else, they show that Rapa Nui had a method for carving memory into signs. The tragedy is that the reading tradition was broken. The signs are still there, but the voice is missing. This is not only a mystery, it is a wound. It reminds us that knowledge systems can be destroyed not because they were weak, but because the people who carried them were attacked, displaced, converted, enslaved, or silenced. That history changes how we should treat the mystery. It is easy to speak of Easter Island as if it simply forgot itself, as if the original meaning of everything slowly faded through some natural process. But forgetting is often forced. Outside contact brought disease, exploitation, slave raids, missionary pressure, colonial control, and the removal of people and objects. When elders die before teaching, when sacred practices are suppressed, when tablets are taken away, when communities are reduced and reorganized, memory breaks. The stones remain, but the system that explained them is damaged. The island did not merely lose a code, it endured history. So if Rapa Nui was trying to preserve knowledge, it was also trying, perhaps without knowing what would come, to preserve against loss. Stone is a good material for that. Wood can burn, voices can be silenced, bodies can die. But stone endures. The Moai stood through storms, social change, toppling, restoration, misunderstanding, and global fascination. They outlived the conditions that made them. They could not preserve everything, but they preserved enough to make us ask better questions. They preserved the fact of a great cultural effort. They preserved the presence of ancestry. They preserved the shape of a landscape organised by meaning. The unexpected thing found by modern reanalysis may therefore be less about a secret and more about respect. The island was not a simple place. The Moai were not simple monuments. The people who made them were not isolated minds trapped at the edge of the world. They were heirs to oceanic knowledge, builders of sacred landscapes, organisers of labour, observers of sky and season, keepers of ancestry, and creators of signs we still cannot read. If AI helps reveal patterns among the remains, then its greatest service may be to remind us that the original intelligence belonged to the people of Rapa Nui. There is a quiet irony in using artificial intelligence to rediscover human memory. A machine scans the island and notices relationships. But those relationships, if real, were made by people without machines. People who walked the ground, watched the sun, listened to the sea, carved stone, raised platforms, and taught children where to stand and what to remember. Modern technology may help us see the structure from above, but ancient life understood it from within. That is an important difference. A satellite can show the shape of a road. It cannot know the story told while walking it. What Easter Island may have been trying to preserve then was a whole way of being oriented in the world. It preserved ancestors so people knew their past. It preserved platforms so people knew their place. It preserved roads so people knew their connections. It preserved solar patterns so people knew their seasons. It preserved chants and sound spaces so people knew how to repeat what mattered. It preserved signs so sequences could outlast a single voice. It preserved the memory of ocean skill so a small island could remain connected to a vast Pacific inheritance. Not all of this can be proven in every detail, but together it forms a reasonable and deeply human possibility. As we return in thought to the Moai, they no longer seem quite as lonely. They stand within a network of relationships, even if much of that network has faded. Their faces are not blank, they are restrained. Their silence is not emptiness. It is what remains when a living system has been interrupted but not completely erased. The roads still point away from the quarry. The platforms still hold their places near the coast. The sun still moves. The ocean still surrounds the island. The Rongorongo signs still wait, carved and patient. The red pukao still catch the eye. The pieces are there, and though the full language is gone, the pattern still suggests that Rapa Nui was built to remember. And maybe this is why the island continues to fascinate people so deeply. It is not only the size of the statues or the remoteness of the place, it is the feeling that something important was preserved just beyond the edge of translation. We recognize the effort. We recognize the longing to make memory last. Every human society does this in its own way. We build monuments, we write names, we keep photographs, we tell stories at tables, we save messages we're not ready to delete, we mark graves, we teach children songs, we try, in all our small and large ways, to leave enough behind that someone later might understand we were here, and that what we loved mattered. Rapa Nui did this in stone, road, sky, sound, and sign. It did it at the edge of the Pacific, on a small island surrounded by distances that would make most maps feel quiet. The Moai looked inward, toward the people who needed them. They held the past in front of the living. They may also have held time, direction, authority, and knowledge in ways we still only partly understand. If Grok AI or any future tool helps us see those layers more clearly, then the discovery is not that the statues were stranger than we thought. It is that they were richer than the simple word statue ever allowed. Now the evening comes down again in our imagination. The island darkens. The last light slips from the faces of the Moai. The red crowns lose their colour and become silhouettes. Somewhere beyond the platform, the sea continues its old work, breaking and returning, breaking and returning. Above, the first stars appear, the same stars that once helped guide canoes across the Pacific and may have lived in song, signs and remembered routes. The stones do not explain themselves, but they do not feel empty. They feel like the remaining pages of a book once read aloud. So perhaps Easter Island was trying to preserve the oldest thing any culture tries to preserve. The knowledge of how to belong to ancestors, how to belong to land, how to belong to a season, a road, a coastline, a story, a sky, and a sea larger than imagination. The island may not give us a single answer, but it gives us a lesson in attention. Look longer, connect carefully. Do not mistake silence for simplicity. And when a stone face stares across the grass for centuries, consider that it may not be waiting to be solved. It may be waiting for us to remember that the past was alive before it became a mystery. And so, dear listener, wherever you are tonight, whether you're near an ocean or far from one, whether your room is bright with morning or soft with late evening, I hope this journey across Rapa Nui has carried you gently. We began with stone faces and ended with memory, which is perhaps where all old monuments eventually lead. If this quiet voyage brought you a little wonder, a little calm, or a softer place to rest your thoughts, I would be grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and stayed with Just About Earth for more slow journeys through the deep stories of our planet. The Moai remain where they are, patient beneath the sky, while we drift back from the island, leaving the Pacific to its waves, the stars to their paths, and the stones to their long, watchful silence.